astonishingly brief period of the last several 100,000 years of Erectus's existence. The human brain's major design modification occurred primarily in the frontal lobes, the part of the brain that controls such uniquely human behavior as speech, long-range planning, delayed gratification, and complex puzzle solving. For the first 110,000 years of our species, there is no consistent record of art, burials, or grave goods. Then, what author John Pfeiffer calls the creative explosion began. A magnificent awakening mysteriously emerged nearly all at once, approximately 40,000 years ago, during which the above-mentioned cultural makers, unique to human, habitually make their appearance in areas as disparate as Australia, Morocco, Siberia, and especially Europe. Now, Otto Binder and Max Flint, in their book, go on to say, "We are not quarreling with natural selection as it applies to other creatures, but we do state unequivocally that Darwinian evolution and natural selection do not apply to mankind at all." And Dr. Robert Bloom, the noted paleontologist, came out with a pronouncement that probably staggered all his colleagues, saying that it was clear to him that evolution was accomplished not by natural selection or mutations, but by spiritual beings of various grades and various kinds of intelligence. Now, the alien geneticists did not desire a repeat of their first experiments. They realized that their error centered on the intelligence of their progeny. The Mark II experiment, Adamic man, his intelligence would be confounded. That's right. The original reason for the leaving of the Mark I sons of the serpent was because they had exactly the same mental capacities and genius and brilliance and technological advancement of their own creators, their own masters from another world. And so, after a certain period of time serving these masters, they decided to up and leave, that they weren't going to sit and be slaves. So they go and create their own thriving civilization on the continent of Lemuria. The masters go back to the drawing board and create Mark II, and this time they realize that they had better not make the same mistake again. So they dumb down genetically. I mean, this can be done in a laboratory today with a few probes in your head. Think what you could do if you had mastered the genome and you had mastered genetics on your own planet. And Genesis, the Bible again, reveals this if you know what you're reading. In Genesis 3 it says, "By the sweat of thy face will be thy bread, until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. For dust thou art, and to dust thou wilt return." This is the condescension, the change in attitude. This is meant to be the Lord speaking to his creations. And the Lord said, "Look, the people are united, and they all have one language. Come on, let us go down, and therefore confound their language, so that they cannot understand one another's speech." Now, there's been a great deal of speculation about this particular passage. What does it mean, and the understanding of the doctrines of religion, where they talk about the fall of the Babylon, and also about this us again, the appearance of this us. Let us go down and confuse the language. So rather than it being the confusion of physical language, I believe it has to do with the mix-up of the chemical soup, the DNA language of the genome and the chromosomes. This is the confusion that is being related to here. Now, the euphemism in the Bible and in the Scriptures to refer to this dumbed-down state, this naive and artificially suppressed state, the euphemism used in the Bible to represent that is the word naked. Adam and Eve, the Adamic race, were sent into the garden, and as the Bible describes, they were sent in naked. This does not mean physically naked. This means intellectually naked. In Genesis 3, "And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever." Now, of course, this is a very heavily debated passage from the Bible. It has that proverbial us again. Let us go down and do something. But it also has this even more enigmatic statement, the tree of life. Let us go down and do something because man is about to eat off the tree of life. He's going to know good and he's going to know evil. How can you know those things unless you have high intelligence? So let's block that. Let's stop that. We can't have that. Let's go down and change things so that man, lest he eat off the tree of life, the tree of good and evil. But what is this tree? We have footnotes for every little detail in the Bible. And yet here, this most important motif that's well known in Christianity, that's in the first book of the Bible, there's so little debate, so little explanation of what the tree of life is actually meant to really represent. But when you take away the mystery, the proverbial mystery, it's then that you have true revelation. The forbidden fruit of the tree of life, both these terms are actually euphemisms for the knowledge of human genetics. So that is what is being suppressed. The tree of life is merely a euphemism, just like the word naked is a euphemism for the knowledge of human genetics, which was the knowledge that the masters, the Nephilim from another world, that was their expertise. And they were now going to dumb their second progeny down so that technical knowledge, the scientific know-how, that type of brilliance would be suppressed. And in that way, they could be more easily controlled. Now this is perhaps the best and most appropriate place for explaining that whole concept of the serpent and why the serpent is really used, why we're calling these individuals the sons of the serpent, and why, as we saw earlier, the serpent is so common a symbol in regards to the gods. The word in Semitic for serpent is Nahash. Of course, they didn't use vowels, so it's just N-H-S-H, but that is pronounced Nahash. And it actually means to discover or to find out. And evidently, this refers to science. The Nephilim were scientists. And as scientists, those people who were able to find things out, they chose the symbol of the serpent. This is not, as David Icke and others have professed, that they looked like serpents. They did not. The serpent was merely their symbol for wisdom, the symbol for higher understanding, the knowledge of genetics, the knowledge of science. And that is because anyone who's actually seen the DNA spiral knows what it looks like. The DNA spiral is very serpent-like. It's coiled and it looks like a serpent. So those who were able to look at it used that symbol of the coiling serpent symbol. Not because they looked like serpents, but because they were wise ones, scientists, those who were able to know the mystery of the DNA and of the helix, the DNA helix. The DNA helix has always, from ancient times onwards, been figured as a serpent, a coiling serpent. And this is the symbol that is still used today on the medical conglomerates and monopolies of the world. The twin serpents, or the tree, the motif of the tree. All through Celtic Ireland, there's a great emphasis on the serpents. And here we have the Egyptian god on the right, with the twin wands. This is Thoth, the god of wisdom, and he's raising the Ankh to the dead Pharaoh. And in Genesis 2 we read, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." Now, in that picture we saw the Ankh being raised to the dead Pharaoh, or the dead god. Now the word Ankh, A-N-K-H, again, ancient languages did not use the vowels. But this Ankh does not mean what we're told it means. We're told it means the key of life, or breath. No, in fact it refers to a word that is known in Babylon and Sumeria as the Anunnaki. Filling in the vowel sounds, we have the Anunnaki. And the Anunnaki, or the Anunnaki, meant the heavenly serpents, literally the gods. So any of the gods who are always shown holding the Ankh in their right hand. You'll always see, if you open any book on Egypt, or you go to Egypt and study the walls there, the symbols, and the great hieroglyphs, you'll always see the gods holding the Ankh. Holding the Ankh literally meant that they were the ones from heaven, the An-Ki, from heaven to earth, the holy ones, the sacred ones, the heavenly serpents. And of course, we only need to look in today's world to see incredible usage of this serpent. But the serpent is still to this day always used in conjunction with medicine and the science of genetics. So it's old, but it's also used today. It's very new. Here we have the whole thing on Time magazine. We not only have the primal couple, Adam and Eve, but we have the tree of life, and the trees are becoming DNA, helix, the spiral, and then in the middle we have solving the mysteries of DNA. The tree of life and the DNA. Is somebody telling us something here? And the word Adam, Adamic man, the word Adam comes from Adom, which means cut off or divided. There again, implying the idea that cut off and divided. This man is not whole. This man is divided within himself. Part of him has been shut down. There's a difference of agenda than they had with the first progeny. Cut off and divided. Leonard Schlein, recounting Plato's Symposium account, he says, Zeus gathered the gods in council to express his concern that these unusual creatures would one day challenge their hegemony. He was loath to exterminate them with his thunderbolts, though, because there would be no one to bring the gods offerings. He solved the problem by putting each creature into a trance and then splitting it down the middle. Upon awakening, each half only dimly remembered what it had been prior to being cleft in two. Zeus explained to the assembled gods and goddesses the cleverness of his scheme. These creatures would no longer pose a threat to the gods, because they would dissipate their considerable energy by spending the rest of their days searching for their missing halves. Well, it's a good policy if you can manage it. Divide a man and you can rule a man. It's so old it's new. And it started in ancient times. In the apocryphal book called the Apocalypse of Adam, we read this. Then God, the Demiurge, that's Sataniel, the ruler of the aeons and the powers, divided us in wrath. Then we became two aeons, and the glory in our hearts left us. After those days, the eternal knowledge of the God of truth withdrew from me and from your mother Eve. Since this time, we learned about dead things, like men. Then we recognized the God who had created us, for we were not strangers to his powers, and we served him in fear and slavery. When God had created me out of the earth along with Eve, your mother, I went about with her in a glory which she had seen in the aeon from which we had come forth. She taught me a word of knowledge of the eternal God, and we resembled the great eternal angels, for we were higher than the God who had created us, and the powers with him, whom we did not know. So here again, in an apocryphal book, that's a book that was left out of the Bible, they're talking about Adam's awareness that he was divided, cut off, and that there was one or more of gods, and that even he and Eve were higher than the gods. Now, the tree of life is often referred to as the tree of good and evil, but this term does not refer to anything esoteric like a lot of people think. It just simply refers to the tree of the good or the evil, or the tree of the good and or the evil. So the term does not refer to anything esoteric. It refers merely to the two contingents or races in residence upon this planet, both of whom were custodians and utilizers of the knowledge of genetics. So literally, the good or the evil. The Atlanteans or the Lemurians. Take your pick. Professor Aricio Nunes dos Santos, who's an expert on Atlantis, writes this. The dragon represents the two races of Atlantis, who contend for hegemony everywhere. They are the twins of all mythologies, the two contending serpents of the caduceus, which devour each other in endless wars from the primordial ages down to the present day. And we know that if we study the Arthurian legends that King Arthur had that famous vision when he was in a cave beneath the earth. He had the vision of the two contending and fighting dragons, the white dragon and the red dragon. This is a motif that you often see a lot in mythology. and we have it in the caduceus, that strange twin serpents of the two serpents facing each other, two contending powers, one black, one white, one good, one evil. We can see this motif in the Mosaic as opposed to the Pharaonic, the great struggle of the Middle East. We see it in the conflict between the Elohim and the Yahwistic philosophies and so on. And we certainly see it depicted in the Christian world between the higher heavenly forces and the demonic forces. Or we'd like to say psychologically now, it's the higher man and the lower man. Now, we have in the ancient texts the vision of Amram, who is the father of the prophet Enoch. He has a dream and he says, I saw watchers in my vision. 2 men were fighting over me. I asked them, who are you that you are thus empowered over me? They answered me, we have been empowered and rule over all mankind. They said to me, which of us do you choose to rule you? I raised my eyes and looked. One of them was terrifying in his appearance, like a serpent. His appearance, his visage, like a viper. Now this text identifies the last watcher as Belial, the prince of darkness and king of evil, while his companion is revealed as Michael, the prince of light, who is also named Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. In today's modern world, we also see this symbol of the tree of life, the fruit of the tree of life, the fruit of the tree of good and evil, used in the silicon world, in technology, like the Apple symbol, striated in the colors of the rainbow and the colors of the sacred chakras. This is the forbidden fruit. So I don't know. I ask you, what is the symbol from a scripture? What is a symbol, a well-known symbol, regarding forbidden knowledge and sacred knowledge that comes out of a religious tome, a philosophical and theocratic tome, doing as a symbol of a leading technocratic and technological company? We've got questions. We also have questions as to other logos in the corporate world. Around the Intel, we have what looks like a serpent. And we find that the word Pentium, which is a word that means nothing in English, if we add the prefix ser, then we have what it really means, serpentium, the serpent, the room of the serpent, or the place of the serpent. Francis Crick, the so-called discoverer of the DNA helix, the cracker of the big code, in his book, Life Itself, he too suggests that an extraterrestrial origin for life. He suggests that life in a microscopic form may have been sent to other planets by alien beings in suitable protective vessels, that life is like a message in a bottle. And is there any evidence of cloning in the ancient world? Well, let's look to the Bible. Genesis 2 has a very interesting statement. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib, which the Lord God had taken from man, he made a woman, and brought her in unto the man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bone, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. And again, note the Time magazine cover on the left. They seem to be happy here using religious symbolism, just like Microsoft, religious symbol and yet a scientific term, cloning humans. But look at the symbolism. It's religious symbolism. We looked at earlier the reasons for the fall given by practitioners of the Judeo-Christian mythology. And of course, it starts at the beginning with Eve at the tree, the primal scene, and the entrance of the serpent, the tempter. John Milton in his Paradise Lost summarizes the scene for us in a very short stanza of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into our world and all our lives with loss of Eden. So yes, the fall from paradise, the loss of Eden, the disobedience in the garden, again specifying Eve. This is the mythology that we're all subjected to in the modern age. It's lasted for 2,000 years. To refute it, we have to go back to the beginning. Now the Lemurians, those who were the first progeny of the Atlantean warlocks, Mark I man, Homo Atlantis, the sons of the serpent, they up and leave and formed their own thriving civilization on a different continent, the continent of Oceania, or more commonly known as Lemuria. The Lemurians, the sons of the serpent, became aware of their creator's second experiments, and they had a dilemma, realizing that the race of Adam was in fact kindred to themselves. They both possessed human DNA. It was therefore decided that representatives would be sent to Atlantis to dialogue with the enslaved and dumbed down Adams and Eves. Thus, we have the story, corrupted later of course, of the serpent entering the garden. So here we have the real story of the serpent entering the garden. What would you do if you knew that one of your family, one of your cousins, somebody that you were bonded by blood, was being a servant in the very garden that you freed yourself from? Yes, you're all right. You're happy. But you have the intelligence to be monitoring what your forefathers are doing. And in the back of your mind, you know, yes, they're not just going to sit pretty with this. The sons, therefore, entered into the garden and spoke with their genetic cousins. They counseled them to throw off their chains of servitude and accompany them back to Lemuria, where they would be initiated into all that had been hidden from them. It is written that the Adams, well, they were resistant to the invitation. Fortunately, the response of the Eves was somewhat different. And so would yours be, because to say the least, the Lemurian children, the children of the firstborn, were remarkable beings indeed. Fully human, when all of that entails, with a close symbiotic connection to the earth and to the universe, and a high, razor-sharp intellect, an intelligence, a scintillating universal intelligence that grasps the finer sciences, a perfect being. The Eves were enamored by these individuals. They were strangely attracted to them. And, in short, the Lemurians came into the garden and said to their cousins, you are in servitude, you are dumbed down, and there's a lot that you should know. And if you come with us, we will awaken you. We will save you and we will awaken you, because just like Christ would later say in the New Testament, know ye not your gods, and what we can do, you can do also and more. Madame Helena Blavatsky, one of the greatest scholars the world has ever known, who looked into these matters, sums it up this way. The appellation Satan in Hebrew belongs by right to the first and cruelest adversary of all other gods, Jehovah, not in the serpent, which spoke only words of sympathy and wisdom. So here is the point of refutation clearly made. Here is the philosophy that refutes the entire Judeo-Christian paradigm from its outset. Not only is Eve not responsible, but we have even implicated Jehovah, the Father, as implicated. How can that be sustainable? Now, interestingly, we have evidence that the Lemurians came into the Garden of Atlantis or made the trip. It's debated how they even knew in the first place what was going on. Did they send spies, or did they have some kind of seeing crystals that J.R.R. Tolkien seems to think that they had? But then when they approached the Garden of Atlantis, when they approached the continent of Appalachia, they actually came by way of spacecraft, because let's not forget, the Lemurians were highly intelligent and had a thriving civilization of their own, both technically and spiritually. And they had the hardware. And when we read chapters like in Numbers number 9, and when the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, then after that the children of Israel journeyed. And in the place where the cloud abode, there the children of Israel pitched their tents. Upon arrival to Lemuria, the Lemurians fulfilled their part of the bargain. They did awaken Adam and Eve to the subtler mysteries. And perhaps that also had to do with genetic awakening, some kind of tweaking of the DNA to turn on those centers that have been dumbed down. I mean, today we think we know all about DNA. Only 3% is known of the DNA. And the mysteries of the tree of life were given unto them. And we see this in the early codexes of the Maya. We see scenes of instruction, not only in the medieval and post-medieval painters, but also in the ancient mythologies. The person sitting under the tree to receive instruction from the shaman or the holy man, the arcane knowledge of the flame. All over the world we see the instruction of the serpent god to his neophyte. And always the image of the female together with the tree of life. And the matriarchy and the tree of life. And it was actually from Lemuria that the high civilizations, the ones we associate with the high cultures, it is from Lemuria that they descend. It's from this time that we have the cult of the priestess. It's from this time that we have the cult of the enlightening, what later became known as the witch. But this is the matriarchal cults, those who were the initiators of the mystery, because being awakened themselves, they were then given to be the awakeners. And it was also noted by the Lemurians, in fact it was never forgot, by the original sons of the serpent, those ambassadors that came from Lemuria and made contact with the women. It was never forgotten by them that the women were the ones, the Eves were the ones who were most responsive originally. This was never forgotten. So the connection, the primal connection between the female Adamic population and the sons of the serpent was particularly strong. And this is what we see in the lineage, in the coming down to us through history of the cult of the matriarch and the cult of the oracle and the cult of the enlightened female, the initiator. It's very curious, in fact, that the Egyptian hieroglyphic for woman is a serpent. In other words, if you wanted to draw the word for woman in Egyptian, you would draw a serpent. It's as simple as that. Now, why that symbol of the many? So the women were the keepers of the gnosis, of the secret arts. The Holy Grail has even now been traced back to the mysteries of the female. In fact, you again only have to look at the etymology. The word secret comes from the word secretion, which implies the biology of the female and the mysteries thereof. The Holy Grail was the chalice, the cup of enlightenment, which is represented by the womb and the waters of life. Now, on the reverse side, we also have the campaign against womankind, the subjugation, the marginalization. And still to this day, a woman can barely hold an office in any kind of clerical sense. Well, it's a long story, and it comes from before Genesis. But in Genesis 3, we read, "Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly thou wilt go, and dust shall thou eat all of the days of thy life." So this is the wrath. Well, of course, the Atlanteans wouldn't be too happy, would they? They're having to be slighted 3 times now. First, they get booted out of their own solar system, out of their own planets. They come to a planet which is devastated by cataclysm. They make a perfect servant who won't serve them. And then when they actually make the perfect servant who will, those servants are seduced away. So they're in a bad state. They're very unhappy. But all through time, we always find the symbol of the female and the serpent. They're very linked iconography. And all through mythology, we have the enlightening female. But we also have the witch. As Christianity got hold of this, they never forgot their old antagonism. So in Queen Guinevere, or Morgane Le Fay, or the Lady of the Lake, or Elaine, the mythology of the female, who is both a shadowy and dark character, but also an enlightening and elusive and alluring character. In the Elucidation, we read, "And the kingdom became dead and desert, for they lost the voices of the wells and of the damsels that were therein." Implying that at one point the damsels, that's the females, were very close to the mysteries. And by the time we move into the more modern eras, the thing has become very sordid. And the campaign of Christianity was to totally invert the image of the enlightening principle of the feminine. And we have the Medusa, and we have Delilah, the temptress, the destroyer of life. Leonard Shlain puts it this way in his fantastic book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess. He says, "When we look back across the historical time of patriarchy, there seems to be some terrible inevitability, a relentless desire to crush the female essence. The question of why is one of the most puzzling of our time." So here we have it, top scholars knowing what the problem is. Well, we all know what the problem is. But again, the answers are so few. Why would it be for thousands of years the marginalization of one of our own sexes? Why? It seems preposterous when you really think about it. And the reason? It must be a reason, and it must be a very serious reason. Now, in Lemuria, when the female Adams, female of the Adamic race and the Adams arrived and were instructed into the mysteries, there was another phase. Because it was not forgotten by the original sons of the serpent about the original attraction to them and the females, occasionally, very occasionally, there was a custom in which one of the sons of the serpent would marry with and mate with one of the Eves. A coupling would take place. Normally the sons of the serpent would have wanted the Adamic race to stay together, that is, the Eves and the Adams to be together in matrimony or in company, in companionship. But occasionally one of the females was selected, a particularly promising one, would be selected to actually bond with one of the actual sons of the serpent. Now mind you, this is somebody who has very powerful awakened alien DNA and human DNA. This bonding, the euphemism for that bonding that's used in the scriptures but has never been revealed, is born of a virgin. So when we hear the term born of a virgin in the Bible, we have to realize that this is a euphemism for conception between a woman and a member of the serpent race. And those who have done their homework will know that the imagery confirms this. When we hear of immaculate conception, we better rewrite that and superimpose genetic conception, because that's all it means. The immaculate conception, the virgin birth, is simply explained in this way. It was said that way because, of course, the Eve was not mating with an Adam, one of her own kind. She was mating literally with a god, a fully enlightened or semi-enlightened individual. And because of this particular nuance, the female was considered to be a queen and also a virgin. And the tale is well told in the arts of the world, in the great legends and mythologies of the world. Again, we take it as fairy folklore, we take it as magical tradition and brush it aside. But the time has come now to take these out of the archive, remove the dust, and start thinking seriously about what we've been told in these mythologies, and not put them down to just old wives' tales and material which is good enough for children. Another euphemism that's used widely in the scriptures for genetics is the terms blood and seed. You know, the blood of Abraham, the blood of the lamb, the seed of Jacob, the seed of him and the seed of her, and the blood of this and the blood of that. Always again in your mind when you're reading this, in order to make sense of these conundrous scriptures, just superimpose the word genetics and all will be revealed. Jesus of Nazareth. The problem with that is they've never been able to find a place on any map at any time ever called Nazareth. So what does it mean? Again, just like the old St. Patrick gig when he was talking about the serpents, and we realized that the serpents did not refer to physical snakes, but it referred as a title to a kind of tribe or a nation. So with the word Nazareth, it is actually a title. There was no locale called Nazareth. The word derives from the Egyptian Nazir, meaning the prince who is sent, and also from Nasir, meaning Sirius. That's a star, the star Sirius. So therefore it is Jesus of Nasirius. Furthermore, the word carpenter, you always hear about Jesus being a carpenter. This again is cryptic language. This is cipher language. The word carpenter comes from the word nagar, which means the serpent priests. Freemasons, even to this day, will use cover euphemisms like this. Instead of saying mason, they may say the word carpenter. But everyone in the know knows what that means. And in Revelation, Jesus' own words are, "I am the root and offspring of David, and the bright and morning star." Well, wait a minute, I thought that's all iconography. I thought that's all paganism. But here's Jesus identifying himself with the morning star, with Venus, or the sun. In the Bible again, "And the angel of the Lord appeared unto the woman, and said unto her, Behold now, thou art barren, and bearest not. But thou shalt conceive and bear a son. For the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines." So here we have some mysterious force, supernatural, supernal force entering in and telling a woman, you're not bearing now, you're barren now, but you will have a very special child born from God. In Judges 13, "And the woman bare a son and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and the Lord blessed him." So many virgin births. Alexander the Great, Theseus, we've got Samson. The world is filled with crucified saviors and virgin births. It's not just Jesus Christ. Now the Semites had many cults, and one of the most popular of the Gnostic cults was the Essenes. Now, there was another group called the Nassines. Perhaps they were related. Anyway, this Gnostic sect believed that the serpent was the moist essence of God. The moist essence of God? The moist essence of God is a reference to the male fluid, is it not? But then we have this term serpent. So are we knowing? Today, under a microscope, we understand that the spermatozoon, has an uncanny resemblance to a serpent or a snake, does it not? The wriggling figure. Well, wait a minute. How could the ancients have known that before they had access to those kinds of instruments? And is somebody trying to tell us something in modern art, in the corporate world? Here we have just one of the many logos that contain these kinds of ancient motifs. Virgin Atlantic. The two words alarm me from beginning. The word virgin and the word Atlantis or Atlantic. But if we study the artwork, what do we see? We see all the ingredients. We see the tree of life on the right. We see a coiling or encircling red dragon. We see some kind of cloned individual, a woman, a female, what they call a syzygy. And right in the front of that is the word virgin over a black heart. Richard Branson's Virgin. Looks like a cute piece of art until we ask some more questions. We hear edicts in the Bible, such as this one. Nor shalt thou lie with the beasts. Implying that there's some sort of bestiality in the Old Testament. And most Christians point to this going, oh yes, ancient Semitic man was running around copulating with the beasts. Of course, this is utter nonsense. What these kinds of terms relate to is not to actual bestiality, but to congress with the serpents. As time passed, the prohibitions started. You shall not lie with one of the serpents. That's out. And this term that we briefly looked at earlier in the earlier part of this program, when Jehovah, Yahweh, announces to his prophet Moses that I am the God of thy fathers. Moses is asking, who are you? And the reply is, the God of thy fathers. Well, let's examine this for a moment. The sons of the serpents were the fathers of the high earth cultures. We've already established that from Lemuria, everything that is positive, everything that is glowing culturally, everything that aspires, everything that's in balance with nature, is coming from the Lemurian paradigm. Okay, so that implies that the Lemurians are the fathers of the high cultures. All right. But their literal fathers, that's the Atlanteans, are the warlocks of Atlantis, who later were in situ in the Middle East. So when Jehovah is announcing to Moses, I am the God of thy fathers, could it be that Moses has had the misfortune to bump into one of the original Atlantean warlocks? A fully alien being with no human DNA whatsoever? Is this the God that people are worshipping for 2,000 or more years? We have the peculiar rite of circumcision, a very ancient pagan rite, but appropriated and picked up by even modern religions. Why? Well, the foreskin is the remnant, is it not, of the real proto-human DNA. And the foreskin is perfectly natural, so it must have been something that our original indigenous population of the earth had prior to the visitation. So what does its removal signify? The ritual of its removal, said to be a divine edict, was to dehumanize and align one with the gods. It is nothing more than the mark of servitude. So, the Atlanteans turn around, or they wake up in the morning and there's no warm coffee, and the slippers are not beside the beds, and they suddenly discover that their Mark II progeny has been seduced away. You can imagine the state that they're in. There was a tremendous ire, a wrath that they had been snubbed again. And the result of this ire was the unleashing of a fully global thermonuclear war, what we might want to call an atomic war. And the myths, believe it or not, are replete with this. From Celtic Ireland when I was 13, I'm sitting reading information from my own legends pertaining to violence and war with super technological weaponry and so forth. Here from the Egyptian mythologies. So the gods were brought together. Ra addressed Nun. Behold, mankind who came from my eye have been scheming against me. Nun replied, O Ra, if your eye was turned against those, how greatly would they fear you? Hathor said, I have prevailed over mankind, and it is pleasant to my heart. Then Ra said, now that I am in control of them, do not reduce them any more. Behold it, the I will be stronger than all the gods. It has mastered those who dwellest at the ends of the earth. It is sovereign over every god. This is spell 316 from the coffin texts. They will fall howling on their faces, and all mankind will cringe beneath you and your might. They will respect you when they behold you in the vigorous form which the master of the primeval gods gave you. So even in the Egyptian mythologies, we're hearing about a punitive god, punitive deities, holding man, their creations, in utter servitude and threatening to destroy them should there be any form of disobedience. In Revelation 12, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought, and his angels, and prevailed not. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. O my people that dwelleth in Zion, be not afraid of the Assyrian. He shall smite thee with a rod, and shall lift up his staff against thee, after the manner of Egypt. O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, and the staff in their hands is mine indignation. Scholars like Commons Beaumont have drawn attention to the fact that when you hear about the rod and the staff, these are actually weapons that is being referred to. In Samuel 4, woe unto us, who shall deliver us out of the land of these almighty gods? These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all manner of plagues in the wilderness. There were the giants famous from the beginning, says the book of Baruch, that were so great of stature and so expert in war. So here we have it, gods and giants who are expert not in bringing peace and feeding the poor, but in war. From Manetho, one of the first historians in the world, the Egyptian pharaoh's historian Manetho, he speaks of the era of the pharaoh Amenophis. His was an intensely dramatic era which culminated in a prolonged war, the invasion of his country by vast and well-armed hordes, accompanied by meteorological events of a phenomenal character, and finally ended in the great catastrophe which destroyed him and most of his nation. Now this appears to be history of a later date than what I'm talking about. I'm speaking of something originally in the Garden of Eden 11 or more thousand years ago, and Manetho, of course, is writing a lot later, but we're going to soon see the answer to that. In the Ipuwer Papyrus, 1780 BC, we read, the land to its whole extent, confusion and terrible noise. For 9 days there was no exit from the palace, and no one could see the face of his fellow. Towns were destroyed by mighty tides. Upper Egypt suffered devastation, blood everywhere, pestilence throughout the country. The book of Isaiah, I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form the light and create the darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Well, I didn't write it. There it is. In 2 Kings, 2 Kings, the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians, 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. Ezekiel 5, wherefore as I live, saith the Lord God, surely because thou hast defiled my sanctuary with all thy detestable things, and with all thine abominations, therefore will I also diminish thee, neither shall my eye spare, neither will I have any pity. So we're talking about the Atlantean gods having absolutely no pity. They retaliate. The Lemurians try to retaliate because they have weaponry too, and they're intelligent and have psychic power also. But there is a tremendous campaign of hatred from the Atlantean side here. That later chroniclers, mythographers in the Bible, they're referring to periods much earlier than the dates in which they were writing. This has been proven. In Ezekiel 6, then shalt ye know that I am the Lord, when their slain men shall be among their idols, round about their altars and on every hill, in all the tops of the mountains and under every green tree and under every thick oak, the place where they did offer sweet savour to all their idols, so will I stretch out my hand upon them and make the land desolate, and they shall know that I am the Lord. Ezekiel 5. So I will send upon you famine and evil beasts, and they shall bereave thee, and pestilence and blood shall pass through thee, and I will bring the sword upon thee, and I the Lord have spoken it. Exodus 9. The hand of the Lord will strike with a deadly pestilence to your livestock in the field. Job 1. The fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. In the book of Job, one person is saying that everything is destroyed. God has destroyed. You should read it. If you read the book of Job, it will clearly show you that some kind of atomic weaponry was being used here. In Jeremiah 4, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord, and by his fierce anger. In Joshua 10, as they fled from before Israel, that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them to Azekah, and they died. And there were more which died with hailstones than they whom the children of Israel slew with the sword. So God's killing more people with his rocks and hailstones here than his servants were doing with the sword. In Psalms 18, the Lord also thundered in the heaven, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Yea, he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and he shot out lightnings and discomfited them. In Psalms 97, a fire goeth before him and burneth up his enemies round about. The Bible makes fascinating reading. It really does. It's better than any of the Marvel comics or any kind of, Rambo movies. Psalms 97 again. His lightnings enlightened the world. The earth saw and trembled. The hills melted like wax at the presence of the Lord. Job 14. He shall flee from the iron weapon, and the bow shall strike him through. Okay, we got iron weapons now. Please note that. In Isaiah 16, chapter 16, we have, for behold, the Lord will come with fire, and his chariots like the whirlwind, to render his anger with fury. So we got whirlwinds and chariots now. In the book of Peter, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which heaven shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also, and the works that are therein, shall be burned up. In Isaiah 2, and they shall go into the holes of the rocks, and into the caves of the earth, for fear of the Lord, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains. A close reading of the language concerning divine retribution compels one to contradict the supernatural context commonly espoused by clerics and annotators. The rhetoric of the Bible concerning God's wrath does not appear to be caused by mere spiritual indignation. The language and tone of the Scriptures is patently martial, vindictive, and catastrophic, and does not seem to be an expression of the divine agency seeking to right spiritual or moral sins. And this has to be taken very, very seriously. When we read any of these passages, I'm just canvassing a few. This is physical. This retribution and these attacks and this violence is a very physical thing. It's not the language of a moral God seeking to rectify moral sins or culpability. Commons Beaumont, in his fantastic tome, The Riddle of the Prehistoric Britain, has this to say: another prolific source of misunderstanding of the past is related to the vexed question of chronology. The Old Testament offers especially a flagrant example in this matter, for here the sequence of history was deliberately tampered with. Some dates are hundreds of years out of their true order. So again, when you're reading the Bible, make sure that you realize that even if you can date the existence of that prophet, which is tough enough, just because he wrote something down or just because a chapter or a passage is attributed to a particular date does not mean that that chronology is correct. Far from it. Beaumont goes on to say, in examining the Scriptures, we must frequently ignore the apparent chronological eccentricities of the prophets of Israel. The Bible is a book of hidden meanings and many events which relate to a far earlier date than which men like Israel, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are supposed to have lived. And Beaumont says, the history of the Old Testament is the history of Atlantis. This scholar just cuts it to the quick. When you're reading about these issues and the whole story of the Old Testament, you are reading about not only a much earlier time, but you are reading about the pre-Diluvian civilizations of Atlantis and Lemuria. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, a lengthy tome of India, that book tells of a demon race which invaded the 3 planetary systems. Opposing the demons was the Hindu god Shiva, who possessed a powerful weapon that he fired at the enemy enemy airships from his own. Ovid, the Latin writer, giants attacked the very throne of heaven, Jove struck them down. 3 times had Poseidon ventured with stern countenance to thrust his arms out of the water. 3 times he was unable to endure the scorching heat of the air. In the Norse Edda of the Teutons and the Scandinavian people, they have the great winters, the winter of the wind, the winter of the sword, and the winter of the wolf. The second winter is called the winter of the sword. Those of mankind left alive rob and slay one another for what is left to feed on. Brother slays brother, mighty battles occur in the world. In Alan Alford's Gods of the New Millennium, he writes, the people, terrified, could hardly breathe. Mouths were drenched in blood, heads wallowed in blood. The face was made pale by the evil wind. The Algonquian Indians, they have this to say, long ago, 2 powerful Manitos, that's 2 powerful gods, felt themselves insulted by the hero Wisaka. This put them into a fearful passion, and intending to kill their enemy, they raged and roared over the earth, which heaved and shook under their angry steps. The Tahoe Indians, there was a time when their tribe possessed the whole earth, and were strong and numerous and rich, but a day came when a people rose up stronger than they, and defeated and enslaved them. Afterward, the Great Spirit sent an immense wave across the continent from the sea, and this wave engulfed both the oppressors and the oppressed. But a very small remnant were surviving. So again, in the early legends, even though they're composite tales and they're sanctified by time, we always hear somewhat of the same refrain. 2 opposing groups, the intervention of gods, wrathful gods, heroes that are in opposition to the gods. The motifs may be the same, even though the individual treatment may be more colorful and different. The Persian legends in the Bundahis book, the Bundahis is a tribe, and the Persian legends, they say, on 90 days and nights the heavenly angels were contending in the world, and the confederate demons of the evil spirit. In the Siberian legends, northern Russia, in the beginning was the earth, but then a great fire arose and raged for 7 years, and the earth was burned up. Everything became sea, and the Tungas were consumed except a boy and a girl who rose up with an eagle in the sky. Rose up with an eagle in the sky. In the Bolivian records, going back some 5,000 years, tells of the destruction of civilization in far-off times as a result of conflict with some non-human race whose blood was not red like ours. Blood not red like ours. Well, what is blood? We were talking earlier about the genetic connection. In the Norse Edda again, and the head of Mimir, fountain of all wisdom, counsels Odin to meet on the field of Vigrid, and to wage there such a war that the power of evil would be destroyed forever, even though his own world would be destroyed with them. So the Skalds, that's the great Celtic and Teutonic Skalds, are saying that the war was so bad that they even contemplated destroying their own planet, the whole world, in order to be rid of the evil that they were fighting. Now death is the portion of doomed men. Red with blood the buildings of gods. The sun turns black in the summer after the winds whine. Earth sinks in the sea, the sun turns black. Cast down from heaven are the hot stars. Fumes reek, into flames burst. The sky itself is scorched with fire. Obviously, this account is talking about the ferocity of the weaponry being used by both sides. Ignatius Donnelly, one of the first American authors to study and write on Atlantis, commenting on the book of Job, he has this to say: "It sounds like the cry not of a man but of a race, a great religious civilized race who could not understand how God could so cruelly visit the world." And this brings up a very important point. Here Donnelly is talking about the cry of the race. We talked earlier about the Elohim and the Jehovah and the Adams. It has to be understood that if we read the Bible in the personal, if we think Adam is just an individual and Eve is just an individual and the serpent is an individual, we're not understanding how these ancient myths work. When we read Jehovah or Elohim or Adam or Eve, we have to think race. We have to think multiplicities of people. Then the story unfolds correctly. Jack Barringer in his Past Shock puts it this way: "It is in one of the most tragic ironies, the majority of humans continue to worship those gods who abused them the most." And that's what we're still doing. Perhaps that accounts, would it not, for some of the predicaments that we find ourselves in right now? And again, in the ancient mythologies, plenty of reference to the super technological weaponry. Here from the Celtic myth and legend, Charles Squire writes of one of our greatest gods. After Nada, the king of the Celts, his sun god, that's his right-hand man, so to speak, was Lu, the famous god Lu. And of Lu he says, "He also had a magic spear, which he had no need to wield himself, for it was alive and thirsted for blood. When battle was near, it was drawn out. Then it roared and struggled against its thongs. Fire flashed from it. It tore through and through the ranks of the enemy, never tired of slaying." So again, 50 years ago, 25 years ago, this may have seemed just like mythology, just like folk tales, not worth paying attention to. But today, as our own technology advances, we can revisit this. Does this not sound like a heat-seeking missile or heat-seeking weapon? As we progress into the future, we can now look back with more clarity to the mythologies of the ancient world. In Zechariah 9, "And the Lord shall be seen over them, and his arrow shall go forth as the lightning. And the Lord God shall blow the trumpet, and shall go with whirlwinds of the south." In Proverbs 20, "A wise king scattereth the wicked, and bringeth the wheel over them." Jeremiah 30, "Behold, the whirlwind of the Lord goeth forth with fury, a continuing whirlwind. It shall fall with pain upon the head of the wicked." Exodus 7, "And Moses and Aaron did so as the Lord commanded, and he lifted up his rod and smote the waters that were in the river, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood." One of the greatest sources for this kind of testimonial of ancient times is the Hindu tome, the Mahabharata. But any Hindu scholar will tell you that the dates given for the Mahabharata are far too recent. This tome could be, they speculate, as old as 6,000 years. From the Mahabharata, we read this: "The Subha clung to the sky at a league's length. He threw at me rockets, missiles, spears, spikes, battle axes, three-bladed javelins, flamethrowers, without pausing. The sky seemed to hold 100 suns, 100 moons, and 100 myriad stars. Neither day nor night could be made out, or the point of the compass." In the battle of the Mahabharata, the warrior king Arjuna was disturbed about the fact that so many would perish. His god and counselor, Lord Krishna, replied to Arjuna's remonstrations, saying, "Fear not to kill those before you, for they are already dead." This is the most mysterious comment and has caused a great deal of debate. Already dead. Not fully human, perhaps? Now, in the Ramayana, another Hindu book, we have mention of an iron thunderbolt capable of killing hundreds of thousands of humans. It was also said to be so powerful that it could have destroyed the earth. These weapons could only be used by royal decree. There is even passages where it mentions the fact that the weapon was used in retaliation for the other side using it first. Now, where have we heard that story before? In the Samargahana Sudrahara, there is mention of manned space rockets as well as their means of propulsion. In the Samara Sudrahara, we find mention of the use of biological weapons, each of which produced its own results. The samhara debilitated its victims by attacking the motor centers of the brain, and the moha caused blockage of nerve impulses, resulting in complete paralysis. In a Chinese book, we find similar descriptions of germ warfare, and again references made to specific weapons causing specific results, just like today's world. Now, the Indian philosopher Ulukya discussed in his teachings the miniature solar system within the atom, molecular construction and transformation, as well as the theory of relativity more than 2,800 years before Einstein. Now, when the Mahabharata was to be translated in the last half of the 19th century into the modern languages, the fanciful descriptions of ancient warfare were generally ignored. Now, why would that be? If no one has anything to lose, just like the old glacialists and Ice Age theorists, if you have nothing to lose, why remove these passages? In Mohenjo-daro in India, what was found corresponds exactly to what was found at Nagasaki, where everything was crystallized, fused, or melted. This mysterious event was recorded in the Mahabharata. One scholar, one professor who was excavating, actually found a corpse in a chair that had basically turned to glass. His whole body and the walls and the chair had been fused into what appeared to be glass, but under tremendous heat. In the Mahabharata we read stunning passages like this. It was as if the elements had been unleashed. The sun spun round. Scorched by the incandescent heat of the weapon, the world reeled in fever. Elephants were set on fire by the heat and ran to and fro in a frenzy. Water boiled, animals died, the enemy was mown down, and the raging of the blaze made the trees collapse. Horses and war chariots were burned up. Thousands of chariots were destroyed. Then deep silence descended on the sea. The corpses of the fallen were mutilated by the terrible heat so that they no longer looked like human beings. Never before have we seen such a ghastly weapon, and never before have we heard of such a weapon. A single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and fire as bright as 10,000 suns, from a shaft fatal as the rod of death. Endowed with the force of 1,000-eyed Indra's thunder, it was as destructive to all living creatures. Hostile warriors fell to the earth like trees burned down in a raging fire. A substance like fire has sprung into existence, blistering hills, rivers, and trees. All are being reduced to ashes. You cruel and evil ones, drunk with pride, through that iron bolt you shall become exterminators of your race. From Pratap Chandra Roy's translation of the Mahabharata in 1889, we read, Gurkha, flying in his swift and powerful Vimana, hurled against the three cities of the Vrishis and the Andhakas a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. It was the unknown weapon, the iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnis and the Andhakas. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. Their hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without apparent cause, and the birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. To escape from this fire, the soldiers threw themselves in streams to wash themselves and their equipment. This weapon was so feared that, in great distress of mind, the king had the bolt reduced to fine powder and thrown into the sea. Even with these precautions, people's hair and fingernails fell out overnight. Birds turned white, and their legs became scarlet and blistered, and the food went bad. Jonathan Cray in Dead Men's Secrets, he says that in Pakistan, 44 exhumed skeletons appear from the year 2000 BC were found to be radioactive. And he goes into many other such cases like that. And all over the world there are such cases. In Scotland, for instance, a old fort or castle on a hillside, the entire corner of it was fused glass. They're finding 14-inch thick glass under the Syrian and Iraqi desert to this day. There is good reason to believe that the terms Sodom and Gomorrah actually relate to Atlantis and Lemuria. We read, Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plains and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. Genesis 24. In the story of Lot, the famous story of his wife and the pillar of salt, this is actually a mistranslation. It wasn't pillar of salt. The translated word is more like our modern vapor. So she was actually turned to a pillar of vapor. In Charles Berlitz's Atlantis, the Eighth Continent, he says, after finding layers of Babylonian and Sumerian artifacts, the archaeologist had passed through 14 feet of clay, which indicated a prolonged flood. Below this strata was reached a level of fused glass, the same kind found at Alamogordo in Texas after the A-bomb blasts. In western Scotland, there's a fort that has one of its sides completely fused into glass, and the same manner. It had received some intense heat, but it was not lightning. Now, Frederick Soddy, no less, this is one of the greatest physicists that ever lived. In his book, The Interpretation of Radium in 1909, he is commenting on the Mahabharata and says, "Can we not read in them some justification for the belief that some forgotten race of men attained not only the knowledge that we have so recently won, but also that power that is not yet ours? I believe that there have been civilizations in the past that were familiar with atomic energy, and that by misusing it, they were totally destroyed." Now, a theoretical physicist and supervising scientist of the Manhattan Project, Robert Oppenheimer, who is familiar with ancient Sanskrit literature, was giving a lecture at Rochester University when a student asked a question to which Oppenheimer gave a strangely qualified answer. And the questioner stood up and said, "Sir, was the bomb exploded at Alamogordo during the Manhattan Project the first one to be detonated?" Now that's a peculiar question in itself. Perhaps this person was familiar with the nuances of the ancient world. So he asks this peculiar question to Dr. Robert Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer's answer is even more perplexing. "Well, yes, in modern times, of course." Now, Professor Hermann Oberth, this is literally the father of rocketry and was the German rocket scientist expert during the period of the Nazis. He says, "We cannot take credit for our record advancement in certain scientific fields alone. We have been helped by peoples of other worlds." And then we have etymology again. We have the word typhoon, which relates to a very strong, powerful whirlwind that is destructive in its nature. This word actually comes from typhon, or the Typhonian beast. Typhon was the great serpent. And the word hurricane, as we saw earlier, cane is the word for the serpent. It's one of the earliest terms for the serpent, just like Cannes in south of France, Cannes Film Festival. Hurricane, the shaking of the serpent, a fierce wind. So in all the mythologies of the world, we hear about the fighting, the conflict of the demon race against the high ones. The Mahabharata, the Celtic legends, and the War of Troy are all meant to have gone on simultaneously, in fact, in history. Now we come to look at the result of all of this. Now we need to look at if there was, in fact, a war about 11,000 years ago, if the original alien masters arrived here approximately 50,000 years ago, and if this war broke out in the region of 13,500 years ago, as the fossil record now seems to be hinting and saying, then we need to say, what has happened since that period? And we find that there was an unforeseen variable. Because if there was indeed a war of the gods, and if evil came into being due to the repeated biomanipulation of Homo sapien, then why is it that neither side seems to have triumphed? That's right. How come it is that we're here 13,000 or 11,000 years later debating this problem, debating this question? Because, say the Atlanteans had won and evil had triumphed, we certainly wouldn't have been sitting here contemplating the question. We wouldn't have this inner dichotomy as good versus evil. And if the other side had won, the Lemurians had conquered, we'd all be living in peace and happiness and tranquility. So why are we not? Why 11,000 years later? A huge, vast expanse of time between where we are now and these events that we're referring to here. How come this problem still persists and has never been resolved? This is the stumbling block for most of the scholars and researchers. And the reason is quite startling. The reason, the unforeseen variable, that event that delayed the denouement was none other than a polar shift of the Earth, a pole shift of the axis of the Earth. And again, where do we turn for the information regarding this polar shift? To the mythologies of the world. Now, Allen and Dallaire, in their book When the Earth Nearly Died, they say that studies have shown that about 10,178 BC, or over 12,000 years ago, the celestial pole was inclined at an angle of 30 degrees from its present position. This, in turn, strongly suggests that the terrestrial axis then orientated differently from today. The gigantic worldwide tectonic disturbances of the late Pleistocene times occurred almost simultaneously on a near unimaginable scale, precisely what could be expected from a powerful external influence, but not from the Ice Age conditions conventionally believed to have existed then. Significantly, a drop in the strength of the Earth's magnetic field appears to have occurred sometime between 13,000 and 12,000 years ago, attended by various other important changes including earthquakes, volcanism, water table fluctuations, and large-scale climactic variations. Of these, severe earthquakes in particular may even induce axial wobble and polarity reversals. So they're talking about the comets, they're talking about the possible destruction of Tiamat that we looked at earlier. They're talking about Tiamat's water by pouring artificially into our Earth, onto our Earth. That may have precipitated a polar wobble or a pole shift. Edmund Halley, after Halley's Comet, he was the first modern scientist to account for the deluge by polar displacement. When he first argued his case before the Royal Society of London in 1692, the revelation was so startling that his paper was not published until 30 years later. We are not talking about something small here. We're talking about the Eiffel Tower stuck headfirst in Georgia. We're talking about rocks the size of cathedrals charging through the air and landing thousands of miles away from where they are. We're talking about seas emptying out of their basins and so forth. This is a calamity the likes of which the Earth had never seen. This is not something that even approximates the first deluge. Water pouring in from another planet that's just been destroyed, that's one thing. It causes tremendous upheaval in the world. But maybe after a few hundred years, there's a semblance of normality returns. But pole shift, that's quite something else again. The destruction that would come with such an event can hardly be estimated. In Celtic mythology, Albion, that's the British Isles, England, Wales, Scotland, and so on, they have been referred to as the Fortunate Isles or the Blessed Isles because it was known by the ancestors that they had survived such travesties. In the book of Enoch, Enoch is saying, I saw in a vision how the heavens collapsed, and when it fell to earth, I saw how the earth was swallowed up in a great abyss, and I lifted up my voice to cry aloud and said, the earth is destroyed. Larry Brian Radke, in his book Astronomical Revelation, says, and the pillars of heaven were broken, the earth shook to its foundations, the heavens sunk lower towards the north, the sun, the moon, and the stars changed their motions, the earth fell to pieces, and the waters enclosed within its bosom burst forth with violence and overflowed it. The grand harmony of nature was disturbed. Now, Brian Radke and some of the other scholars are happy to tell you that these events that they have researched and they know existed and they know occurred, but they're looking to comets and to other natural phenomena. And my thesis, in my work, in my reading of the text, these events were precipitated by human error and by human interference. In Chinese mythology, over 2,000 years BC, in ancient times, Kung Kung strove with Chuan Shu for the empire. Angered, he smote the unrotating mountain. Heaven's pillars broke. The bonds of the earth were ruptured. Heaven leaned over to the northwest. Hence, the sun, moon, and stars and planets were shifted in the southeast. Well, that's right. Any kind of axial wobble, any kind of pole shift, if anyone even survives this, they're certainly not going to be seeing the same heavens, the same stars, the same positions of the luminaries. Everything will be seen to be in chaos. Absolute confusion will reign. Clifford Wilson, in Chariot Still Crash, So terrible was the storm that even the gods afeared at the deluge. They took flight and went into the heaven of Anu. Cowered they like dogs and crouched down at the outer defenses. Well, of course, you can imagine that the gods who unleashed this war weren't prepared for this. They didn't realize that the ferocity of their own weaponry would precipitate a pole shift, would precipitate an axial wobble, would precipitate the moisture of the air being completely incinerated, which would then affect the magnetic shield of the Earth and the Roche limit, which then in turn would attract some more of the debris that was already out there from Tiamat. So again, more ice, more rain falling to the Earth. Now the word Atlas in Greek actually means the one who could not withstand the skies. And in Sanskrit, Atlantis or Atlas means deprived of its pillar, the bottomless, sunk to the bottom. Poseidon, this is the famous god, of course, of the ocean, but specifically he was the monarch of Atlantis. Po comes from the word Sirius, and Don, the lord of. And he was known as the creator of men, but also as the god of earthquakes. So here in one mysterious word, Poseidon, we have the whole story being told. Poseidon is the god of the waters. Poseidon is the god of Atlantis. But Poseidon is the earth shaker, the one who brings the earthquakes upon mankind. And his name means the Lord of Sirius, meaning from another place, from the stars, from the outer worlds. So it was that Earth lost the continent spoken of in the world's great legends. Appalachia, or Atlantis, Tyrrhenia, Oceania, Beringia, Fennoscandia. So today when scholars and antiquarians and archaeologists are digging around the Mediterranean area and saying that they've discovered Atlantis, no. They've discovered a great civilization that perhaps was controlled by Atlantis, because Atlantis was an empire. The city of London, in ancient times during its empire, controlled many areas of the world, and likewise did Atlantis. From the Toltec Song of the Feathered Serpent, Toland's towers are burned. Quetzalcoatl and his family are arrived here after the death of his homeland. From the Hopi Song of the Flood, down in the bottom of the sea is the proud cities and the worldly treasures corrupted with evil. From Ezekiel 17, though you be sought for, yet shall you never be found again. From the Egyptian papyri, south becomes north, they say, and the earth turns over. From the Laplanders of northern Sweden, their mythologies say, I shall reverse the world. I shall bid the rivers flow upward. I shall cause the sea to gather together itself up into a huge towering wall, which I shall hurl upon you wicked earth children, and thus destroy them and all life. The Aztecs, our forefathers dwelt in that happy and prosperous place they called Aztlan. In this happy place is the great mountain in the middle of the waters called Culhuacan, because it is the point turned over towards the bottom. And for this reason it is called Culhuacan, meaning the crooked mountain. Culhuacan from Culhua means the serpent mountain. So here again we have the same motifs, the same refrain. The crooked mountain, the mountain that used to be one direction but is now turned over. And it was the place of the serpents. The Mixtecs, another instructed Mexican tribe, described the Culhuacan as the place of heaven, where the gods erected a sumptuous palace and dwelt therein. A great deluge occurred there in which many of the sons and daughters of the gods perished. And the Athenians of Greece, a priest of Sais told Solon, that's Plato's father, when the mighty power aggressing against the whole of Europe and Asia was held at bay by Athens alone, this vast power, he said, wantonly made war and endeavored to subdue at one blow our country, Egypt, and yours, Athens, and the whole of the land. That same vast power failed in their efforts, and then the great catastrophe suddenly burst upon the invaders and defenders. Nonus, the historian, in his work, he says, there was a tumult in the sky, shaking the joints of the immovable universe. The very axle which runs through the middle of the revolving heavens was bent. In Plato's Timaeus, forwards and backwards, and again to the right and left, and upwards and downwards, wandering every way in all 6 directions. In one day and one fatal night, there came mighty earthquakes and inundations that engulfed the warlike peoples. In the book of Baruch, there were the giants famous from the beginning, that were so of great stature and so expert in war. But they were destroyed, because they had no wisdom and perished through their own foolishness. The Russian mystic writer, Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, writes, under the evil insinuations of their demon, Thevetat, the Atlantis race became a nation of evil magicians. The giants and magicians and all flesh died, and every man. And Commons Beaumont writes, the prehistory of the Atlanteans and the race of Adam possessed peculiar similarities. The supermen of Plato's island were drowned in a flood like the Adamites, the giants of old time, men of renown, the men whose thoughts became wholly evil, destroyed in what is called the flood or universal deluge. The cause advanced for their destruction was in effect the same in both cases, they being accused of having mastered too many of the divine secrets of, or as we should say, science, as the ancients named it, the gods. Herodotus, the ancient historian, I observed that there were seashells upon the hills, and that salt excluded from the soil to such an extent as even to injure the pyramids. So he's talking about the sea level, that around the pyramids and around the Sphinx, definitely there was salt water at one time. And Tony Bushby, in his Secret of the Bible, says, some researchers advanced the possibility that seashells provided evidence that the Great Pyramid was erected before the deluge, a theory supported by much abused Arabian traditions, supported by the narratives in the Book of the Dead, and by a curious watermark running round the Great Pyramid 2/3 distance up its face. The Zuni Indians say, earthquakes shook the world and rent it. Creatures turned fierce, becoming beasts of prey, wherefore others turned timid. Wretchedness and hunger abounded, black magic, war, and contention entered into the hearts of men and creatures. So in the Zuni myths, they're talking about the coming of evil. They're saying that the mentality, the behavior of animals changed, and the mental paranoia and schizophrenia of the human race began. In the book of Habakkuk, the sun and moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of thine arrows they went. Joshua 10, and the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and hasted not to go down about a whole day. So here we have in one passage of the Bible the idea that the scriptures are saying that not only was there a war, but celestial events were awry, and that there was two, again, opposing peoples, a tremendous war that couldn't be abated. From the Bible again, the earth is utterly broken down, moved exceedingly. So the earth is moved exceedingly. Isaiah 24, behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste, and turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. So how come we haven't heard about this in Sunday school? How come the pastors and the preachers are not explaining what this passage means? In 2 Peter we read, for this they are willingly ignorant of. The world that was then, being overflowed with water, perished. So why is it that when we hit the Sunday school, and we're taking the Bible classes, no pastor or preacher goes into the terms and explains what these mean? These are talking about physical events. We've been under mind control for so long, we don't even know what we're reading when we're reading it. Here we have a statement that people are willingly ignorant. The book of Peter is saying that people are willingly ignorant as to the events of the past. In John 21, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. Yes, that's right. Sea where it should be is no more. Sea that was over here, it's gone. Sea that's up in the sky, a whole planet of it, Tiamat, it's no more. The whole earth is in decay and chaos. From Geoffrey of Monmouth, one of the early pre-medieval historians of England, in his book, The History of the Kings of Britain, writes on the prophecies of Merlin. The moon's chariot shall run amok in the zodiac, and the Pleiades will burst into tears. None of these will return to their duty expected of it, Ariadne will shut its door and be hidden within the enclosing cloud banks. In the twinkling of an eye, the seas will rise up, and the arena of the winds shall be opened once again. The winds shall do battle together with a blast of ill omen, making their din reverberate from one constellation to another. From the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 14, from the Apocrypha. For in the old time also, when the proud giants perished, the hope of the world governed by the hand escaped in a weak vessel, and left to all ages a seed of generation. So the books that were purposely left out of the Bible, the Apocrypha, in this book they're saying there were survivors and they escaped in a weak vessel. That means some sort of vessel that was impaired, not working correctly, but they were able to escape. Now we spoke earlier about the unforeseen variable, the idea that we're still inherited this problem of evil and the problem of conflict, the problem of the alien versus the human DNA in us from 11,000 years ago or more. And we've inherited because the pole shift prevented conclusion. But what we also must understand, and one of the reasons for the great delay, is that after you have had a pole shift of this kind of magnitude, it's unforeseen by the perpetrator, it's unforeseen by the oppressor, it's unforeseen by the oppressed. Both contingents were not ready for this. They had no idea that the earth would respond this way. Like H.G. Wells talks about in his Time Machine, that man's violence awoken the earth. Earth's violence followed the human violence. Well, this is the same situation we find in the ancient days. And the earth is an upheaval. The 5 great continents have sank beneath the waves. What goes with it? What goes with it is all the spaceships, all the crystalline computers, all the technology, all the hardware, all the rockets and weaponry that both sides have. It's all destroyed. So we have the predicament of moving mankind forward. The Atlanteans decide that they have no choice now but to move mankind forward in history, to manipulate history, to move us forward to the point where we can rebuild the technology that they have lost in ancient times. The loss of their technological hardware was a major setback and predicament for the Atlantean serpents. They decided to manipulate the flow of history and the destiny of their Adamic progeny, pushing us ever forward to the point where the super technological hardware that was destroyed in the War of the Gods could be reproduced. Some instruments and weapons had survived, and these were sequestered in underground chambers and in temple precincts, referred to as the Holy of the Holies. And the Book of Enoch, like many of the scriptures, talk about the refashioning of a lot of this weaponry. It's another motif that we read extensively in the mythologies of the world. And Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and to make known to them the metals of the earth and the arts of working with them. And they were led astray and became corrupt in all their ways. In Druidic tradition, in Welsh tradition, we have the Peralt. These are a fraternity of powerful druids who practiced metallurgy in caverns beneath the earth, who fashioned artifacts like the Cauldron of Power, as well as instruments known as the gifts of the gods. That's right. They had to set about sequestering the weaponry that was left over, but they had to also subjugate the whole earth. They had to start mining. They had to start creating the metallurgy and getting the ores together to recreate all the hardware that they had lost. Because just like a gunfighter in frontier America, stripped of your gun, you feel naked. You may have all the intelligence in the world, but if you haven't got the instruments of authority and power, you're naked and you're helpless. Commons Beaumont says, I have said comparatively little in regard to this prehistoric science and weapons, including firearms, although it is manifest that they played the most vital part in ancient power politics. Possession of the knowledge of metallurgy must have been one of the most urgent yet secret objects on the part of those who desire to rule the ancient world. I cannot overstress how vital and important is always the problem of weapons. The science of ancient explosives has never been historicized to my knowledge, yet it lies at the root of most prehistory, for its knowledge and application enabled those who had mastered the secret, so jealously guarded, the innermost of mysteries, to rule over men and to claim godlike attributes. Now, Dr. R.V. Dolphin, after studying in the Libyan desert, studying the glass, Dolphin suggested that for the ancient Phoenicians to have worked with temperatures equivalent to 6,000 degrees Celsius, they must have known the secret of atomic power. 6,000 degrees, of course, is only 2,000 degrees short of the temperature of the sun. And yet here is the good doctor in the Syrian, Libyan desert studying artifacts, digging up beautiful artifacts, beautiful globes and glassware. The only trouble is, it's been made in furnaces, which is almost atomic energy would need to be used. The temperatures are so extreme. The Smithsonian Institute and the Bureau of Standards in Washington have brought to light various objects that prove that 7,000 years ago, people were producing steel in furnaces at a temperature of 9,000 degrees centigrade. And we have, even from the most junior high, the most elementary level of education, a big question. How come the Iron Age, which is meant to be the earliest age, is the one that comes first? We have the Stone Age, which is the earliest period. We have the Copper Age, we have the Bronze Age, and then we have the Iron Age. So closest to us, our own time, we have the least complicated. It takes a great deal more skill to make copper and bronze than it does to make simple iron. And of course, the argument always put before us is, no, iron was more needed because, of course, it was made into weapons. But that's a side story. That's not what we're asking. We're asking, how come the sophistication precedes? So, meaning as you go further back in time, the skill with ores gets more. Well, it's the same predicament that you have when you go to any indigenous tribe of any culture. They always talk, do they not, of their own ancestors being more sophisticated and more cunning and more artful and even sometimes more spiritual than they. Every culture, they never put themselves first. They never say, we are the smartest ones in our own history. They always talk about their own ancestors being more advanced. Now, why would that be? The mighty flood frees the ship known as the Naglfar, a vessel that the giants were so long in building. Loki steers the ship of hell, and the Fenris wolf is aboard. This is from the Norse Edda again, the Viking mythology. And the ship, the Naglfar, sails out from the east. At its helm, Loki, with the children of darkness, the doom bringers, offspring of monsters. Of course, anyone who spent a few days or weeks studying the Viking and Scandinavian mythology, you know that Loki was the dark one. Loki is the god of evil. Well, here we have Loki flying a spaceship, refurbishing an old spaceship with this bestial weapon on board, the Fenris wolf. After the destruction, after the demise of the 4 or 5 great continents, and Celtic mythology talks about lots of other islands as well, as we saw a little bit earlier. But if Fennoscandia, Tyrrhenia, Beringia, Atlantis, Appalachia, Oceania, if Lyonesse and Lachlan and all the ancient islands of Avalon that the ancient books are talking about, if all of these have sank beneath the waves and land is scarce, but you have a certain amount of survivors on both sides, both contingents have survivors, then what happens next is very important to modern history. We can surmise that the original Atlanteans were fewer in number than the progeny they later create. It goes without saying that the visitors may have been fewer than the beings that they later created. So that means that the sons of the serpent, the Lemurians, and their Adamic wards probably were larger in number than the contingents that were on Atlantis. No one knows for sure, but we can gather that this was the case. So, when we follow the histories and the mythologies through, we find that the serpent race, this is the original Atlantean race, they decide, after the pole shift, to now converge at the new equator, specifically Asia Minor and Mesopotamia and Sumeria. And Sumer, by the way, in Celtic means the land of the dragon. So the original serpent race come together, what's left of them, and they decide to vacate wherever they are and regroup at the new equator, because of course this is the only area that would actually sustain life all the year long. So they converge in the area of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Sumeria. The sons of the serpent, that's the Lemurians, together with their Adamic wards, they choose to do the opposite. They disperse to the corners of the earth, and they take their advanced Lemurian culture with them. So the Lemurians, for some reason, decide to do the opposite. And that could be because they realized that those Atlantean warlocks of theirs could still be out there, ready to hunt them down, and that they're very vulnerable. So they make the decision to split up and send contingents to different corners and quadrants of the earth. But here at the Sumerian, Asia Minor, the Middle East, the junction of the Tigris and Euphrates River, this is the area that became the new center of empire, based, of course, on the Atlantean pattern. The word Europe, in Greek mythology, Europa was the daughter of the phoenix, which rose from the flames of destruction. And one doesn't have to be an expert in mythology to understand what this means. Europe is literally the one that has risen from the flames of destruction. Europa, the daughter of the phoenix. Dionysius of Susanna says, "They were the first great founders of the world, founders of cities and of mighty states, who showed a path through seas before unknown, and went each wandering tribe far off to share a different soil and climate. Hence arose great diversity, so plainly seen mid nations widely severed." So there we have it, folks. There's the answer. People who've studied these mysteries have long wondered how come the same symbols, the same dances, the same customs, the same artwork, the same performances, the same language. All over the world we find the same shapes and images and iconography. No matter how far you go, from New Zealand to Celtic Ireland, from Celtic Ireland over to the Mexicos, to North America, to China, to the Druids, to the Vikings, to even South America and Africa, we find a continuousness, a same similarity in symbolism and iconography. Well, of course, if it's one group dispersing and bringing the same culture to all parts of the world, could that not explain it? Commons Beaumont again. The ancient civilization of the land we call Egypt has been pronounced by archaeologists as flawless of its type from the very first. It reveals none of the painful steps from primeval beginnings passing through the Paleolithic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age to that of iron. It apparently burst upon the scene into exotic radiance, its perfected civilization accordingly having been described as a miracle. Science cannot admit any such miracle, and another explanation must be forthcoming. In the book of Deuteronomy, "Whither shall we go up, our brethren? Have discouraged our heart, saying, the people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and walled up to heaven. And moreover, we have seen the sons of the Anakims there." And of course, we learned earlier that the Anakim is another word for the Nephilim. So here we have in the book of Deuteronomy, eyewitnesses saying, yes, the Anakim are housing themselves in great fortified walls now. They're living behind cities. Sir Leonard Woolley, in his book The of the Chaldees, writes, "There is nothing to show to what race the first inhabitants of Mesopotamia belonged. At a date which we cannot fix, people of a new race made their way into the valley, coming whence we do not know." John Keel, in his book Our Haunted Planet, writes, "According to the traditions of many isolated peoples, the first great emperors in Asia were god kings who came down from the sky, displayed amazing superhuman abilities, and took over. There was a veritable worldwide epidemic of these god kings between 5000 and 1000 BC. Professor W.B. Emery, in his book Archaic Egypt, writes, "At approximately 3,400 years BC, a great change took place in Egypt, and the country passed rapidly from a state of advanced Neolithic culture to two well-organized monarchies. At the same time, writing appears. Monumental architecture and the arts and crafts develop to an astonishing degree. There appears to be little or no background to these fundamental developments." Now, Dexter Perkins and Patricia Daly write in their book, "Why did a lifestyle that had been so successful for tens of thousands of years give way to one so different? Modern hunting peoples, though living for the most part in marginal areas, are frequently better nourished and always more leisured than their agrarian neighbors. Agrarian peoples not only must work a good deal harder for their sustenance, but are much more precariously balanced in relation to their environment, since they have substantially altered the natural ecology of their surroundings. Diodorus Siculus writes, "The Egyptians themselves claimed that their ancestors were strangers who in very remote times settled on the back of the Nile, bringing with them the civilization of their motherland, the art of writing and a polished language. They had come from the direction of the setting sun and were the most ancient." So Diodorus here is saying that the Egyptians may have been those coming from Lemuria and not Atlantis. The Atlanteans are settling somewhat more north in Sumeria, Babylon, and farther to the east. But the Egyptian paradigm may have been in fact based on the Lemurians who settled there. Charles Bourlitz, he speaks of the new calendars. The Hindu, Egyptian, and Babylonian calendars start or commence a new cycle from the point of 11,500 years to 11,000 years BC, fairly close to the figure given by Plato for the end of Atlantis, or 9,500 years before his time. And is it not from this time that we have not only the rise of the great bloodthirsty empires, but all the later empires that move up into historical times and all the paradigms that we associate with modern city life? It all originates somewhere. It originates from exactly that period of time, from the Atlantean paradigm-based empires coming out of the Middle East. It's from those times that we have the concept of a removed and distant impersonal God. It's from those times that we have the concept of an evil God out there somewhere, or heaven and an afterlife. It's from those times that we have the idea of nature and woman being debased. It's from those times that we have acquired inheritance, or walled cities, when animals are domesticated, and the coming of the meat diet. What we know as the family organization, with a male invariably at the head, and the separatism racially and culturally. We have military strength and warlords as heroes. We have conquest and territorialism. We have the enslavement of foreigners or an overpopulation. And the list goes on and on and on. All of these things that now pester the human race, they have an origin also. And they come out of these times about 11,000 years ago, when the history books and the scholars are only too happy to tell you it all begins then. The whole lot all begins then. And we know that this is simply not true. And James DeMeo, in his fine book Sarah's Razia, says, after 3,300 BCE, divine kingship, the despotic central state, human sacrifice, slavery, polygamy, concubinage, female seclusion, infant cranial deformation, swaddling, and circumcision appeared in Mesopotamia in fully blown institutionalized form. Erich Fromm, in his book Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, he writes, while granting that we do not have much direct knowledge of man's psyche before the beginning of the Neolithic period, there are good reasons to assume that the most primitive men were not characterized by destructiveness or sadism. In fact, the negative qualities that are commonly attributed to the human nature become more powerful and widespread as civilization developed. James DeMeo goes on to say, the enterprise of Columbus, if it occurred today, would without doubt be called a genocide, with accurate comparisons to the atrocities of Hitler or any of the world's most cruel and thuggish brutes. The merciless enslavement, mutilation, torture, and slaughter of just under 1 million island Arawaks at the hands of his followers, all within a few short years of his arrival at Hispaniola. The Europeans were not the first to create havoc in the New World, and by the time of the Europeans arrived, very many patristic tribes already existed in North America. Many were already cruel and murderous. Large patristic empires preoccupied with war and human sacrifice and led by blood-drenched god-kings. Influences did come from over the Bering Strait during the years prior to 8000 BC. These earliest migrations were of a peaceful and matristic social character. Patrism simply did not exist in any significant or enduring manner at those times. There is no evidence for it. These early, peaceful people spread out and populated the islands of Oceania and the Americas as well. One can travel through large parts of both North and South America and visit places which are named after peaceful Indian tribes which have altogether vanished from the face of the earth. In the book Against Civilization, with agriculture usually comes the division of labor, increased sexual inequality, and the beginnings of social hierarchy. Priests, kings, and organized impersonal warfare all seem to come together in one package. And David Watson, in his Pathology of Civilization, writes, "Perhaps we will never fully understand the mystery of that original mutation from egalitarian to state society. Certainly, no standard explanations are adequate." There's also a theory abounding in some researchers' minds that the earth in fact suffered such a calamity during these pre-Diluvian periods that in fact it may be dying. Is there credence to this theory? The migration and resettlement of the surviving Atlanteans and Lemurians was compromised by the continuing earth changes. The after effects of the original polar shift and realignment, these changes continue to this day, being prolonged and severe. Aridity, that's the loss of moisture in the atmosphere, is the most conspicuous and devastating after effect. But volcanoes, earthquakes, climatic deviations, erratic weather patterns, loss of topsoil, desiccation, loss of forests and grasslands, oasis, and the shrinking of rivers and wadis all have a major ecological effect. Additionally, with mankind's own proclivity for ecocidal behavior, we can be in little doubt as to the future welfare of the planet Earth. Recent research into the Schumann wave fluctuation patterns suggests that the planet may be slowly dying. Now, the King Djeser from the 3rd dynasty of Egypt, "I am in mourning on my high throne for the vast misfortune, because the Nile flood in my time has not come for 7 years. Light is the grain. There is lack of crops and all kinds of food. Each man has become a thief to his neighbor. They desire to hasten and cannot walk. The child cries, the youth creeps along, and the old man falters. Their souls are bowed down. The council of the great ones in the court is but emptiness. Torn open are the chests of provisions, but instead of contents, there is air. Everything is exhausted." D. N. Wadia, in his book The Post-Glacial Desiccation of Central Asia, looks into this problem also. He writes, "In Asia Minor and Syria, which is called the graveyard of 100 cities, in Iraq, which possessed not many centuries the most fertile plains between the Euphrates and the Tigris, the granary of the ancient world, in parts of Iran, India, China, the same sequence of events has happened: increasing dryness, migration of the indigenous flora and fauna, erosion of the soil cover by wind and undisciplined rush of water across the fields during the few occasional rainstorms, and the loss of vegetation cover. These ravages of nature have been supplanted by acts of man, his misuse and neglect of soil, overstocking and overgrazing of cattle, deforestation, political turmoil, and the depredations of war." So could this be true? Could it be that Gaia itself is dying? Here are the scholars talking about the post-Diluvian world, all the inhumanity and injustice and cruelty and want of the post-Diluvian empires. E. F. Huntington, in his book Principles of Human Geography, writes, "In all parts of Palestine, unnumbered ruins show that once the population was more dense than now. In Judea, Samaria, and Galilee, the terraces of vineyards, the cisterns of farmhouses, strewn scores of barren hillsides, or are scattered far beyond the limits of modern habitations. Old villages are waterless. Elsewhere, the limestone hills are so devoid of soil that a single farmer, and far less a whole village, could scarcely find land enough to raise crops." So from just a cursory look at some of these accounts, we can see that something is seriously amiss with the health and the welfare of mankind and of the earth in the post-axial shift, in the post-deluge, and in the post-war of the gods, leading up into modern times. Which leads us again to the more specific question of the nature of evil and the origins of evil, because these external events, a war of the gods or the destruction of the earth, what is that doing psychologically to the mind and to the heart of man? He's already in a schizoid situation because of the tampering with his own biology, his own DNA, the fundamental essence of a human being. He now has to deal with the fact that he's part alien in his nature. And this alien, cold-blooded, merciless nature sitting beside his human nature, his symbiotic connection to the earth and to the matrix of the universe. And again, the ancient mythologies have a great deal to say about all of this. In the book of Enoch, the child which is born to you shall survive on the earth, and his sons shall be saved with him. When all mankind who are on the earth die, he shall be safe, and his posterity shall beget on the earth giants, not spiritual, but carnal. Canon George Rawlinson, he speaks of this genetic devolution. They were the boldest mariners, the greatest colonizers who could boast a form of government approaching to constitutionalism, who of all the nations of time stood highest in practical arts and sciences, and into whose lap there flowed an increasing stream of the world's greatest riches, until the day came when they began to care for nothing else, and then the enjoyment of the material comforts and luxuries took the place of the thirst for knowledge. We have Commons Beaumont talking about the great falling off. For many generations, reports Plato, the people of Atlantis despised everything but virtue, not caring for their present state of life, thinking lightly on the possession of gold. But in time, the divine portion began to fade, and their human nature got the upper hand, having been too often diluted with the mortal admixture. The Atlanteans became unseemingly and base, having lost the fairest of their precious gifts. Now here, Beaumont is phrasing it sort of differently. He is emphasizing the falling off, but as many Christians also think, this is separation from God. We're handed this cartoon idea that because man has distanced himself from the Creator and from God, that is the account. That's the reason for his moral falling off. But could it be something much more intricate than that? Something more elaborate? Not just a simple falling away from spirituality, but actually a schizoid nature within himself. In Lenormant and Chevalier's Ancient History of the East, they write, "In these legends we find traces of a wealthy nation, constructors of great buildings with an advanced civilization analogous to that of Chaldea, professing a religion similar to the Babylonians. A nation, in short, with whom material progress was allied to great moral depravity and obscene rites." Hermes Trismegistus, "So the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches by main force into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds, and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. The pious will be deemed insane, and the impious wise. The madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked man will be esteemed as good." From the Norse Edda, we have the prophetess predicting the falling off of man. In the caption, it says, "Then saw she wade in heavy streams men, foul murderers and perjurers, and them who others' wives seduce to sin. Brothers slay brothers, sisters, children shed each other's blood. Hard is the world. Sensual sin grows huge. These are the sword ages, the axe ages. Shields are cleft in twain, storm ages, murder ages, till the world falls dead." And in a similar refrain in ancient Ireland, the prophetesses and queens of the Tuatha Dé Danann, after their war with the dark powers, Queen Bave goes up onto the mountain to proclaim the victory. But in doing so, she also offers this prophecy. And I want to emphasize that this prophecy we're about to look at comes 5,000 years BC. Shall we think that the world that she is talking about is the world that we now have inherited? Then she added a prophecy in which she foretold the approaching end of the divine age and the coming of a new one, in which the summers would be flowerless, the cows milkless, and the women shameless, and the men strengthless, in which there would be trees without fruit and seas without fish, when old men would give false judgments and legislators would make unjust laws, when warriors would betray one another and men would be thieves, and there would be no more virtue in the world. From the Vishnu Purana of the ancient Sanskrit people, we read, "There will be contemporary monarchs reigning over the earth, kings of churlish spirit, violent temper, and ever addicted to falsehood and wickedness. They will inflict death on women, children, and cows. They will seize upon the property of their subjects and be intent upon the wives of others. They will be of unlimited power. Their lives will be short, their desires insatiable. People of various countries intermingling with them will follow their example. Wealth and piety will decrease until the world will be wholly depraved. Property alone will confer rank. Wealth will be the only source of devotion. Passion will be the sole bond of union between the sexes. Falsehood will be the only means of success in litigation, and women will be the objects merely of sensual gratification. External types will be the only distinction of the several orders of life. A man, if rich, will be reputed poor. Dishonesty will be the universal means of subsistence. Weakness, the cause of dependence. Menace and presumption will be substituted for learning. Liberality will be devotion. Mutual assent, marriage, fine clothes, dignity. He who is the strongest will reign. The people, unable to bear the heavy burden and the load of taxes, will take refuge among the valleys. Thus, in the Kal age, will decay constantly proceed until the human race approaches its annihilation, its prayala. Here we have it, millennia-old prophecies, not talking about the world that they inhabit, but the world that is to come. From the Book of Enoch to the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Skaldic Edda, and the Vedas, and the Celtic myths and legends, all speaking about the end of the divine age and the coming of one in which depravity will be the norm. When we look outside the window today, when we lift the newspaper or turn on the television, these prophecies sound all too pertinent to the world in which we have inherited, and we have to deal with it. But could this world and all of these creations be the actions of the gods that we worship? Instead of falling away from the light and falling away from the gods, could it not be our allegiance to the gods that has actually caused this problem in the first place? Now, evil, of course, is a relative term. Those who prosper from their evil perceive it as good, and see real good as a hampering weakness which needs to be repressed or even expunged. The propensity for immorality and evil, which exists personally and socially, came into being from the Atlantean hybridization process. Perhaps the Lemurians desired in time to reverse the process, but lacked the technological hardware after the pole shift. Perhaps the alien gene was to be conditioned out, made less dominant by the reinforcement of particular ritualistic identifications with nature, the supreme healer and balancer. This process was again, for the most part, thwarted by the advent of the unforeseen earth changes. And the net result is that the post-Diluvian humanity is left with the consequences of their schizophrenia, with each person condemned like Hamlets to deal with their moral dilemmas as best they can. As Nobel laureate Konrad Lorenz said, man is the missing link between the apes and human beings. It's like Mahatma Gandhi, when asked about civilization, he said, yes, it would be a good idea. And the great scientist and humanitarian Wilhelm Reich said, civilization, we have never had it yet. And as we saw earlier, the very word Adam originates from a word Adam in Semitic, which means cut off or divided. Cut off from nature, cut off from himself, and cut off from that which is his true destiny. You can't tinker around with the natural order, and you certainly can't tinker around with the genetics of a human being and have everything be okay. And then if man inwardly, psychically, frenetically is in turmoil, what is likely to be happening to the world that he builds around him? What's likely to happen in the relationships that he cultivates? The great scientist and biologist and student of schizophrenia, Julian Jaynes, according to Jack Barringer, Jaynes claimed that this period, thousands of years ago, was a time of intense psychosis for the emerging human race. And Terence McKenna, in his interview in the Institute of Noetic Science magazine, he says that Jaynes has suggested that human consciousness has changed its character even in historical times. The ego, as we now know it, was not really in existence except under extreme stress. And then it presented itself almost as an exterior intrusion into consciousness, like the voice of a god. Julian Jaynes and R.D. Laing and some of the other scholars who are studying the nature of the human psyche are saying that the ego is a modern thing, a modern creation, and only came about in us because of the trauma which was visited upon us after the pole shift and the subsequent War of the Gods. It was the stabilizing psychic muscle that kept us from completely falling apart, spiritually speaking and mentally speaking. Sigmund Freud had the same idea, but perhaps he was looking at things from the wrong end of the telescope. According to Theodore Roszak, Freud traced the original psychotic trauma to the mythic father of us all, somewhere in the dim prehistoric past. In effect, the archetypal father figure invented the repression of the instincts, first by emasculating his sons, then by becoming the focus of the remorse they felt for venting their murderous rage upon him. That's right, it's one of the earliest theories of Sigmund Freud, the idea of the primal father, the oppressor, that the sons have to rise up to kill, creating primal guilt, the original sin. But perhaps Freud was onto the subject but not got it quite correct. Perhaps it was the father, the Atlantean fathers, that caused the psychosis. And in fact, if we look at our human fears and phobias, it might make more sense to think of them rather as psychological phobias and fears, but that their origin may be physiological. For why is it that we're scared of thunder and lightning, and of darkness and caves and hollow places? We have fear of water, we have fear of heights, of loneliness, of insects and certain other animals, and of enclosed spaces, and even paranoia against foreigners. And it's always put down to us by the psychologists that these are psychological fears, they just came about. So a man's fear of the ocean, that deep fear, that just came about psychologically. What? From a Homo sapien that's meant to have existed on the planet with oceans for perhaps millennia? Why would you have such an irrational fear? But wouldn't you have that fear if you racially encoded into your DNA, encoded into your racial memory, saw the whole earth torn apart, visited by unimaginable ravages, and it was an historical blink of the eye? Such events are written in our genetic memory, and that is the origin of all these fears and phobias. They are physiologically based, not psychological. Terry Kellogg emphasizes the fact that abusive behaviors, whether we direct them towards ourselves or other people or other species, are not natural to human beings. People enact such behaviors because, he says, something unnatural has happened to them. I and they have become deranged. David Watson, in The Pathology of Civilization, writes, "We reproduce catastrophe because we ourselves are traumatized, both as a species and individually beginning at birth. Because we are wounded, we have put up psychic defenses against reality and have become so cut off from direct participation in the multidimensional wilderness in which we are embedded that all we can do is to navigate our way cautiously through the humanly designed day-to-day substitute world of symbols. A world of dollars, minutes, numbers, images, and words that are constantly being manipulated to wring the most possible profit from every conceivable circumstance. The body and spirit both rebel." James DeMeo, in his Tsarion, destructive human aggression and sadism in its worst forms, to include despotism, warfare, ritual murder, and the brutal subjugation of females and children for sexual purposes, are a relatively recent development in human history, of less than 6,000 years duration, traceable back in time to Central Asia and Arabia. One of the statements that Plato made about the location of Atlantis was through the Pillars of Hercules. And people thought that that meant, again, something physical. All the literalists took that to mean, yes, the Pillars of Hercules. That is, if you go westward through the Mediterranean, you'll arrive at Spain, and then you'll pass out into the Atlantic Ocean through these Pillars of Hercules. But the writers of old were brilliant storytellers, and often wrote in allegory and in fable, using symbolism, rich symbolism. A closer reading of Plato, and we find that the Pillars of Hercules were something quite different than some physical pillars at the gates of the Atlantic Ocean. The Pillars of Hercules are the twin columns. We see a lot of images of the twinning Here in the Egyptian, we have the two trees that stand either side of the gateway. In great structures like the Taj Mahal, we see the twin columns. Here in the tarot cards, we see the priestess between the two temples of Solomon. And the black and the white pillars always represented the banks of a river, like the banks of the river Nile. Occasionally we see heroes or even the Christ figure situated between two pillars to emphasize symmetry and opposition. Here in the Celtic books, again, we have the saint between two pillars. In Freemasonry, we see also a great deal of emphasis on the two pillars, the pillar of the sun and the pillar of the moon, the pillar of the east and the pillar of the west. And anyone who takes the time to visit a Freemasonic lodge will always see these two columns prominently displayed. In Babylon, we have the strange image of the tree of life between the two hybrid deities. We have the twin serpents of the Maya. And we have the Babylonian chalice of initiation showing the two serpents or the two pythons entwined. These, of course, are representing the two natures of mankind, that man is now a bipolar entity. Young children are wont to remark when seeing the deities of India as to why they all possess these 4 arms. Well, if you have 4 arms, it often implies that you're 2 people in one. 2 people in one would make 4 arms. And we have the left wing and the right wing again of Egypt. Freemasons also have a central figure in the double-headed eagle. One head of the eagle or phoenix facing east and the other facing west. If one studies a swastika, you'll find that it originated with 2 serpents. The Falfot, the original symbol of the swastika, comes from 2 interlaced serpents. And as we saw earlier, mythology is replete with the war or the conflict between man and his hybrid nature, his own lower self. The Old Testament puts it this way, in a passage that relates to the conflict between Jacob and Esau. We read, "In your limbs lie nations twain, rival races from their birth. One the mastery shall gain, the younger or the elder reign." But these are not just myths. As Carl Jung in his Approaching the Unconscious writes, the universal hero myth always refers to a powerful man or God-man who vanquishes evil in the form of dragons, serpents, monsters, demons, and so on, and who liberates his people from destruction and death. So the mythologies may often be referring to what appears to be an external conflict, a great hero fighting a dragon, and it can be read like that if you so desire. But we need to also realize that these external portrayals represent the inner conflict, man fighting his own nature, the 2 brothers, the 2 twins, the higher and lower natures, Lucifer and Satan. It's inside. For some of us, it may be nothing more than the conflict over a more petty side of us. Shall we steal? Shall we not steal? Shall we rise over the bones of another individual? Shall we lie? Shall we cheat? And for others, it's a much greater conflict. Joseph Henderson, he writes, in many of these stories, the early weakness of the hero is balanced by the appearance of a strong tutelary figure or guardians who enable him to perform the superhuman tasks that he cannot do unaided. And let's not forget again that with this schism, with this inner conflict, the brain moves into a left hemispherical type of thought, and the feminine is repressed. And when you repress the feminine psychologically, you also do so sociologically. And therefore we have, from 11,000 years on, from the advent of official history, we have the rise of patriarchy and patriotism. Patriarchy arose after the threat of invasion, conquest, and war. Tribes feared being overtaken and decimated, and therefore, out of necessity, strong male leaders began to replace the female matriarchs. This, of course, is the official line. Well, if your world has been in chaos and you can hardly even feed yourselves, let alone build cities and fortify yourself and protect, of course now the balance completely changes. Those who were close to nature, the woman would have been more in the forefront politically, religiously, and socially. But once the earth is in upheaval, and now all you need are the muscular skills in order to be able to secure yourself and your culture, your race, your people, suddenly the masculine abilities, the masculine powers become dominant. P. Stern, in his Prehistoric Europe from Stone Age Man to the Early Greeks, writes, "The influence of the mother goddess, who had been all-powerful during the Stone Ages, now began to wane. Male deities, gods of war and conquest, were in the ascendant." James DeMille remarks on the advent of patriarchy. "There is no evidence to suggest that peoples of the more fertile times went about warring with each other, nor did they possess child abuse practices. The female principle was held in high status, or possibly revered. Where rock art was the dominant form, the female is seen to have occupied an equal or even central place in society, and was not viewed with anxiety by the artists. Royal tombs, excessive grave wealth, female grave murder, temple architecture, fortifications, weapon technology, and the fully blown nomadism were absent from these early cultures, as were male gods and phallic imagery. In all cases, the arrival of militant armored nomad groups from Central Asia and Arabia initiated cultural transitions which destroyed the male-female and maternal-infant bond and placed all family matters in the hands of the dominant males. The early peaceful people were either exterminated and replaced by the armored newcomers, or they were enslaved, losing their own cultural identity and legal controls over their land, property, and very lives. The once self-regulated, free choice of sexual partner and mate selection was increasingly suppressed and subordinated to the demands of parents, priests, and kings. An emphasis upon military matters occurred with strong men leaders growing in power and veneration, to the point where the masses enthusiastically genuflected to divine kings. In all cases, change towards increasingly stratified political hierarchy and despotism was accompanied by institutionalized changes in family structure towards an increased male dominance over basic life decisions of females and children, and increased control over children by parents of both sexes. Sadistic abuses within the family, in society at large, and in the military appear to have increased in direct proportion to these changes. Polygamy, the harem, veil, general seclusion of females, sexual slavery, male and female genital mutilation, the eunuchism, all developed within the Sarrasian zone as power of dominant males, divine kings, and military castes grew. So we have something very serious happening here to mankind, something that is out of nature, out of context, and something that can only affect us in an extremely negative way. But these, again, utter changes are merely the mirror, the projection of what is happening to an individual within. The original tweaking of our DNA has caused all of this. That, compounded by the earth changes, so severely traumatized the human race that we have the ego replacing the self as the center of consciousness. We have the masculine proclivities becoming dominant. All these atrocities that we see in the so-called modern world can be traced back to an origin. But this origin has been concealed. And the reasons for all of these traumas and horrors of the world has also been concealed. You put religious in front of us and a God, and people stop thinking. We have this phenomena in ancient literature, and we also have modern questions arising as to the reptilians. After the pole shift, the Atlanteans continued a seek and destroy policy against their nemesis, the Lemurians. Despite having scant technological hardware, they also managed to continue some primitive genetic experimentation. The fauna of the Earth was studied, and eventually alien DNA was crossed with that of several species of creature. It was found that the reptile possessed the qualities that the alien masters of Atlantis had desired all along. So after you've failed twice with humanoids, and you know that going back to the drawing boards again is not probably going to work, and you don't even have the technology anymore, you don't have the super technologies and the computers and all the laboratory equipment that you once had, That's all several fathoms beneath these new oceans that have appeared. What do you do? The ancient legends say that they went back to the drawing boards for the third time, and this time they said, listen, why do we even deal with a humanoid in the first place? That's been nothing but a cause of problems from day one. And there's plenty of other life forms and species on this planet. And perhaps they had done like that on their own planet. So, they experimented on all the fauna of the Earth and crossed their alien DNA with many of the species of the fauna, including the reptile. And that is where we have the theory of the reptilians. The reptilians are not from other planets. They do not come from other solar systems and visit the Earth. They're actually made right here on the Earth. All mysteries, all history, all mythology is filled with images of the strange births of the unicorn and the minotaur and the centaur and whatnot. And we have the mythology of the siren coming out of the Greek mythology. Of course, we have the symbolism of the dragon again. But these are dragons who have the gift of speech and the gift of wisdom even. Clement, in his apocalyptic fragment, writes, "And on earth shall be monsters, a generation of dragons of men, and likewise of serpents." David Fidelier, in his Jesus Christ, the Son of God, writes, "Delphi was also known as Pytho because before the coming of Apollo, the site was haunted by a monstrous serpent or dragon." And from the Babylonian legend of creation, we read that men with bodies of birds of the deserts, human beings with the faces of ravens, these the gods created, and in the earth the gods created for them a dwelling. In the midst of the earth they grew up and became great, and increased in number. This legend is talking about that not only were these beings created, but they were created in laboratories perhaps beneath the earth. And somebody would say, well listen, if there are these reptilians, how come we don't see them walking around today? These individuals, because they also possessed alien DNA, could look quite humanoid, because the original aliens, as we said, were not serpent looking. They were humanoid looking. Ostensibly you could walk past one in the street. And some of the reptilians would have been born like that also. Though they had reptilian DNA, they could look quite human, and some looked very reptilian. So the ones that looked too reptilian, they were phased out or moved into caverns beneath the earth. Some people say they still are there. And that is why even up to the Middle Ages, you always hear about the hero having to go and prove his manhood by knocking on the door of some dragon and do battle or conquest with some hideous monster. So right up and almost until modern times, history confirms that such beings existed. And again, from Babylon, we have architecture, sculptures, bas-reliefs, images, sculptures showing hybrid animals and hybrid creatures. Here on the left is a phoenix-type bird, the Babylonian eagle gods. On the right is a reptilian lizard female with her offspring. We have cave paintings of erect, standing, bipedal lizard-type beings. One of the greatest American scholars in this subject, Professor J.J. Hurtak, says, "In our research, we have come across statuary of very grotesque beings who, according to the Indian and shamanic tradition, went into the earth at the time of a great cataclysm." So from all over the world, we not only have the stories of heroes and gods and great conflicts, but again we have the hybrid being, the hideous monster. We have suppression of facts regarding the skulls and skeletons of these types of beings as slowly it's coming to light. G. Warren Shufelt, a researcher, discovered the underground tunnels beneath Los Angeles, which the Hopi Indians had for centuries believed were inhabited by a lizard race over 5,000 years before. Robert E. Dickoff, in his book Agartha, tells of a Tibetan monk who learned that an alliance of reptilians and human black magicians were causing chaos and destruction in the surface societies by projecting malevolent energy fields into people's minds, using what we call witchcraft, the manipulation of energy. Dickoff says that the monk led 400 warrior monks into the caverns to do battle with this serpent cult. And in Ireland again, the Celtic legends, we have the Fomorian race. This is the earliest prehistoric visitors to Ireland before any of the other races got there. And as we learned earlier, the Fomori means giants, but it also derives from a term meaning those from under the sea. And if you read Celtic mythology, you'll actually come across statements of the Fomori and realize how the gods had to fight them. And there's descriptions of these beings, descriptions of them, descriptions of their king, description of their heroes or so-called warriors. It makes fascinating reading. In the Emerald Tablets of Hermes, we read that only by magic could they be discovered. Only by sound could their faces be seen. But you know, the masters were mighty in magic, able to lift the veil from the face of the serpent, able to send him back to his place. Came they to man and taught him the secret, the word that only man can pronounce. Swift then they lifted the veil from the serpent and cast him forth from the place among men. Yet, be aware, the serpent still liveth in a place that is open, at times to the world. Unseen they walk among thee in places where the rites have been said. Again, as time passes onward, shall they take the semblance of man. Speak I of ancient Atlantis. Speak of the days of the kingdom of shadows. Speak of the coming of the children of shadows. Out of the great deep were they called by the wisdom of the earthman. In the form of man they moved amongst us, but only to sight were they as men. Serpent-headed when the glamour was lifted, crept they into councils, taking form that were like unto men, slaying by their arts the chiefs of the kingdoms, taking their form and ruling over man, to destroy man and rule in his place. Here we have an interesting Mayan picture of a god on the left with some kind of weapon and a shield coming to do combat. But if we study the image on the right-hand side, we will see that it's a large green serpent that has a man in his mouth. There's a large green serpent devouring a human being. If we study this corporate logo from the Italian company Alfa Romeo, we not only find a Knights of Malta or Knights of Columbus, Knights Templar cross on the left, but we find, strikingly, the very same symbol on the right. A green serpent devouring a human being with a crown above the serpent's head. And curiously, Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi has exactly that image in his garden. A large black serpent with a crown devouring a human being. And many corporate logos feature the symbol of the serpent, either in a designer abstract way or in a much more clear way, all throughout the world. In fact, the word Pepsi actually means serpent in Egyptian. In Egyptian, they used to scare their kids by saying, Pepsa will get you, or Apep, and Pepsi was the name of the devil in Egyptian. In this Origins and Oracles series, the program entitled Subversive Use of Sacred Symbolism goes into this in a great deal of depth. And we might ask, who is protecting us from those supposed to be protecting us? Here's the symbol of the Marine Corps with a large green dragon in the motif. And many features, many programs, not only for adults but also for children, and many movies extensively feature the symbol of the lizard or the reptilian. One could do a 5-hour program on that alone. Many involve not only the symbol of the dragon or the serpent, but also of the Masonic pyramid. In the movie Conan the Barbarian with Arnold Schwarzenegger, we actually see one of the heroes or anti-heroes of the show actually turning himself into a lizard. This film is situated clearly in pre-Diluvian times. The whole motif of the movie is to situate it in prehistoric periods. But we find it in much of our modern context, in music. We find the bestial symbols being used in the music business and in the corporate world today. Dick Gregory, the famous comedian, says, "Pay attention to Hollywood movies very carefully, for they normally tell you in a subliminal and occult way what they're going to do." Of course, we noted earlier that the caduceus of Hermes is the worldwide symbol for the medical profession, but here the World Health Organization uses clearly the symbol of the serpent. And in fact, our symbol for money, the American dollar bill, the symbol is this: two parallel lines vertically piercing the letter S. But in fact, that is a very ancient symbol. Here in a table of ancient symbols, we find the dollar sign, or what looks like the dollar sign, but that sign was originally known as a scourge. Now, if you look up the word scourge in a dictionary, it will tell you that it is a whip or a bond or a lash for brutalizing and keeping people in order, for keeping slaves in order. The scourge of the worlds. Now, the reptilians that possess and control many of the corrupt world leaders who engage in pedophilia and ritual murder for the same reason. Having access to precise genealogical records, they know who to seek out as victims, those innocent that are of the Lemurian bloodline specifically. This is the answer to much of what lies behind the exposés of Kathy O'Brien, Arizona Wilder, Bryce Taylor, and others who have come forth to reveal what they have seen and experienced behind the corridors of power. The hybrid reptilians were created to seek out and destroy the Lemurians on behalf of their alien masters. This was like their day job. This process has not ceased in ancient times, but still goes on today. Now we come full circle to examine what has happened more distinctly in our own times. We don't have time in one presentation or even in a series of presentations to delineate and examine every single machination of these entities in the last 11,000 years. But we can look at a few that are specific to our own times. Now, when the pursuers of the Nephilim destroyed the planet Tiamat, they made haste to leave our solar system to avoid the cosmic upheavals created by their action. However, for some reason, they took extraordinary precautions to prevent their enemies, should they be still alive on our planet, from ever leaving. They erected a powerful energy barrier around our entire planet. This enveloping shield still exists, and no one on Earth can physically break through or go beyond it. Now, earlier we saw that the Nephilim arrived on our planet not by their own free will. They arrived here approximately 50,000 years ago, and the subsequent pole shift and the War of the Gods occurred about 13,005 years from our present age. Now, the Nephilim arrived in our solar system after being expurged from their own planetary systems, wherever those may be. I tend to think that that was Draco, the constellation of Draco, or Alpha Draconis perhaps. They arrived here not of their own free will, and the pursuers, after destroying Tiamat, had to make haste to leave, because we don't drive our car through an earthquake by choice, do we? But before they left, they erected a membrane and etheric barrier around our Earth just as a quarantine measure, in order to make sure that just in case the Nephilim, their hated nemesis, were on this planet, that they could never again leave to spread their evil elsewhere in the galaxy or the universe. That barrier is the true Stargate. So when we hear about that term, the Stargate, we should realize that it also has historical precedence, and it's up there. A shield or a barrier around the earth, and the mythologies talk about it. The ancient scriptures talk about this barrier around the earth. It's part technology, but it's also part etheric energy, far in advance of our own science today. In the Pistis Sophia, one of the most ancient Gnostic texts, it says, "The outer darkness is a huge dragon, whose tail is in its mouth." And that was the symbol that has come down to us from mythology to illustrate this particular encircling field of energy. The serpent with a tail in its own mouth, which is called the Ouroboros, the encircling dragon. you'll often see symbols of the dragon encompassing a globe or something of great price, like a pearl or a diamond. The Native American Indians have often referred to it as the great web in the sky. And we might wonder about, again, modern symbolism. And who knows what. Here we have the symbol for the United Nations with the earth with a strange grid and the Roman laurel leaves encircling it. In Revelation 8, we read, "And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key to the bottomless pit." In the epistle of Peter, God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into the chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. So we're hearing in these scriptures that the earth and the internment is described as a bottomless pit in which the Lord has interned the dark ones, that the beings can enter into our earth atmosphere or through the membrane, but the Nephilim specifically, any entity with the alien DNA simply cannot go beyond this barrier. They are contained here until the time of the judgment. Now, the assassinated researcher and theorist Bill Cooper writes, "No man has ever ascended higher than 300 miles, if that high, above the Earth's surface. No man has ever orbited, landed on, or walked upon the moon in any publicly known space program. If man has ever truly been to the moon, it has been done in secret and with a far different technology. The tremendous radiation encountered by the Van Allen belt, solar radiation, cosmic radiation, temperature control, and many other problems connected with space travel prevent living organisms leaving our atmosphere with our known level of technology. Any intelligent high school student with a basic physics book can prove NASA faked the Apollo moon landings. If you doubt this, please explain how the astronauts walked upon the moon's surface enclosed in a spacesuit in full sunlight, absorbing a minimum of 265 degrees of heat, surrounded by a vacuum." So this piece of controversial information is in fact the truth. You cannot go to the moon. The Stargate is connected with the orbit of the moon, like the moon may be the lodestone or the lock. And the orbit of the moon is in some way connected to what keeps this Stargate active. So you can go to the moon. You could actually go to the moon, but you couldn't go beyond it. And as Bill Cooper is saying here, because of the radiation and our level of technology, it is a fallacy that we've even gone to the moon. Here, from all cultures again, the Ouroboros, the encircling dragon. Always in its clutches, in its protection, is the pearl of great price. Here the artist is actually showing the dragon encircling the world. And of course, again, we have the old mythological motif of the hero slaying the dragon. Now we can understand that in slaying the dragon, there's also a tie-in to leaving the earth, being able to be free to explore the heavens. So in slaying the dragon, it's opening the Stargate. There's a connection now between these two paradigms, carefully disguised in mythology and in folktale, but with an incredible celestial meaning behind it. Now, research has demonstrated that some 30,000 years ago, a highly developed civilization existed in the Andes, and also that the Earth's moon was not there at the time. This supports the evidence which suggests that the moon is not a natural satellite, but an artificial construction parked there some thousands of years ago. That's not as far-fetched as it seems, because of all the planets in our solar system, our moon is vastly bigger. The moons of Saturn and the moons of Uranus or whatever planet are minuscule. They are actually true satellites. Very, very small. Our moon is more like a small planetoid. It's vastly bigger than the other moons of other planets. Michel de Nostradamus, the famous French clairvoyant, says, "He will come to take himself to the corner of Luna, where he will be taken and placed on alien land." Then we have the Lunar Society. Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, Erasmus Darwin was the founder of the Lunar Society. The group's name owed itself to the fact that the members met monthly at the time of the full moon. The membership boasted such luminaries as John Wilkinson, who made cannons, James Watt, who owed his notoriety to the steam engine, Matthew Boulton, a manufacturer, Joseph Priestley, a chemist, Josiah Wedgwood, who founded the famous pottery business, and Benjamin Franklin, no less. So here we have some of the most illustrious scientists and inventors and politicians, and they all belong to this society known as the Lunar Society and make a point of meeting at the time of the moon. Well, hold on. I thought scientists refute all such occult principles. Virtually all the Royal Society founding members, says Michael Bagent, were Freemasons. One could reasonably argue that the Royal Society itself, at least in its inception, was a Masonic institution. And when we do our homework, we find out that the Lunar Society was the prelude or the predecessor to what later became the Royal Society. The Royal Society grew out of an occult organization. In England, we have the organization known as the Hellfire Club, created by Sir Francis Dashwood, the famous Satanist. But Dashwood was also the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the Government of England. Other members were the son of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Potter, the Earl of Sandwich, who was also a member of the House of the Lords, the Marquis of Bute, who became the Prime Minister of England, Charles Churchill, John Wilkes, and George Bubb Doddington, another member of the cabinet. And the Hellfire Club is known satanic enclave. The moon landing of July 20th, 1969, the so-called moon landing. But what is not widely known is that alongside the national flag, Buzz Aldrin also carried a Masonic banner. This has been embroidered especially for his strange journey by the librarian of the Masonic House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. That's right. So here we have the cameras rolling when we have the official flag of the United States being positioned on the moon. But hold on, half an hour before, we've got this whole Masonic ceremony. Well, wait a minute, I thought this was a free country and there's meant to be freedom of the press. How come we weren't privy to that one? How come the moon is even being dedicated to some strange occult fraternity before it's being dedicated to the American people? So whether you believe there was an actual visitation to the moon or the whole thing was staged, either way, even in a staged event, the proclaiming of the moon in a ritualistic way should raise some very serious questions here. And of course, we have the strange phraseology that from beginning to end of the Apollo missions, we have this strange, bizarre phraseology which NASA has never satisfactorily explained. One of the most obvious and most heard euphemisms, of course, is the eagle has landed. And everyone associated that with the eagle symbol of America. But in fact, the eagle is a Masonic symbol because it is really, what is being referred to is really the double eagle of Freemasonry and not the bald eagle of America. The double eagle is a very famous symbol of Freemasonry. It was originally the emblem of the Habsburg dynasty of Europe, a very powerful set of oligarchs and royalty that still exist and are responsible for innumerable wars and dynastic rivalries. Now in the Quran, chapter 9:11 no less, it says, "For it is written that a son of Arabia would awaken a fearsome eagle. The wrath of the eagle would be felt throughout the lands of Allah." Now, as I said earlier, we have not got the time to deal with all the sundry historical machinations from the last 11,000 years. But one particular period, one particular epoch that should concern us is what we know today historically as the Renaissance. About the time of the 15th century, as they were congratulating themselves on their progress, the alien bureaucracy discovered the presence of the Stargate. They had to face the fact that even if all their technological hardware was successfully reconstructed, they still could not vacate the planet Earth, which had been placed under quarantine. So here we have it. Hundreds, thousands of years are going by. The alien progeny have understood that yes, all the technological hardware that they once had created and had brought here to the planet Earth, which may have even included spacecrafts and all sorts of cybernetic, technologically advanced devices. All of it, or a good deal of it, has been destroyed. So here they are, spending 11,000 years moving mankind gradually, manipulating every phase of history, putting whole nations under the swords, stretching their empire out to encompass the whole of the globe, mining and enslaving the whole human race in order to slowly, incrementally push the technology further to the point where they can restore some of this. And that accounts for why in the world, for 11,000 years, we've been so sexually and genetically and genderally and emotionally and psychologically arrested, while we're so super technologically advanced. But they've realized, after they discover the Stargate, that now, even if they manage to succeed in phase 1, the Stargate exists. They're in quarantine. Perhaps they'll never be able to leave after all. And they probably found this out the hard way. A very huge and puzzling meteorite fell thunderously in Soviet Siberia on July 30th, 1908. Peasants heard the awesome explosion as far as 620 miles away. A large area of forest was flattened as if an immense object had fallen. No remnants of the alleged meteorite could be found anywhere underground. Radioactivity had initially been released in enormous amounts. The general destruction showed that the energy released had been far greater than the mere impact of a falling stone, no matter how huge. Most significantly, the aerial path of the falling object had not been uniform, but had amazingly changed during descent. Various Soviet scientists then put forward an amazing theory, that it had been a spaceship driven by intelligent beings and loaded with a great power from a nuclear power plant, which had exploded through some accident. Well, if you go along with the theories we're advancing here, we can edit this statement slightly. From the Renaissance, and probably before, through this process of pushing mankind forward, the alien progeny of Atlantis, their descendants, of course, probably were able to build some rudimentary spacecrafts. And it was through taking these up into the ionosphere that they discovered the presence of the Stargate. And perhaps crashing right into it, these spaceships would then fall back to Earth in the way just described here. So it's not that we should understand this as spaceships coming into our solar system and then entering into our Earth atmosphere and then mysteriously veering and careering out of control and crashing into the Russian forests. It can hardly be said that those who've got the ability to cross hyperspace would then enter into our planetary space and lose control of their spacecrafts. There's something doesn't sit quite right with that story. More likely, Earth ships are making journeys into the ionosphere in order to penetrate the barrier and can't do so, and then perhaps they lose control and fall back to Earth. But undaunted by this discovery, the alien progeny decide to press ahead. They put their greatest intellectuals onto the problem to see if a solution could be found, believing that what technology could erect, technology could take down. The major dynasties of the planet underwrote occultists, scholars, scientists, and philosophers to work on the Stargate problem. Elaborate efforts were also made to cover up the existence of the real opus. The perfect covers came to be that of both science and occultism. It was so effective that even today, most students and practitioners of both science and magic are unaware of the practical importance of their work and to whom it is really of benefit. Those of the inner sanctums also adopt clever cover acts and stories in order to be able to work undetected. Fronts are utilized by all major criminal syndicates, and it is no different with the children of the Nephilim, who have a great deal to hide from public view. And at this point we should remark that, of course, when we talk about the Atlantean progeny, we're not talking about the originals. These beings from other worlds with a pure alien DNA, and perhaps even some of their progeny, those with human and alien DNA, live for extended periods of time. There's reports that the original alien warlocks could live for up to 700 years, but they are not eternal and do in fact die. So the Atlantean progeny, the bloodline that we're talking about, are descendants of the original warlocks of Atlantis. We can surmise that none of the original warlocks exist, although some accounts say that they do. So who are the new Atlanteans? And how would we identify them? Well, we've got strange personalities all over history. Open any history book and faces stare out of you. Machiavelli, Nostradamus, all these bizarre creatures and characters and the dramatis personae of history. Interestingly, here we have a picture of Rasputin, the Russian warlock. Well, the word Grigory means in Greek the fallen one or the fallen angel. And of course, Rasputin was the devil responsible for the destruction of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. But we can speculate that the great kings have the alien blood, and perhaps even some of the popes. And it's not so far-fetched when you start reading some of their biographies and penchants for slaughter and abuse. We have in English mythology William the Conqueror, of course, the Norman king who brought such destruction and mayhem to England. In fact, so bad it was that the people of England referred to his reign as Doomsday. This is the term that the Saxon English used for the seizure of their land and the subsequent taxation, which was hitherto relatively unknown. William the Conqueror brought the pyramidical organizational structure to feudal England. But just before he died, and I mean a matter of days before William died, he had this to say: "I have persecuted its native inhabitants beyond all reason. Whether gentle or simple, I have cruelly oppressed them. Many I unjustly disinherited. Innumerable multitudes, especially in the country of York, perished through me by famine or the sword. Having therefore made my way to the throne of that kingdom by so many crimes, I dare not leave it to anyone but God alone, lest after my death worse should happen by my means." And of course, no Irish person on the planet can forget the scorched earth policy of Oliver Cromwell, who literally murdered thousands of Irish people in an all-out blitzkrieg. The 14th century Plantagenet King Richard II, one of the most unpredictable of English kings, after the unsuccessful Peasants' Revolt, he declared this to his Saxon underlings, and these are his own words: "God omnipotent is mustering in his clouds on our behalf armies of pestilence, and they shall strike your children yet unborn and unbegot, that lift your vassal hands against my head and threat the glory of my precious crown. You wretches, detestable on land or sea, you will seek equality with lords and are unworthy to live. Give this message to your colleagues. Rustics you were, and rustics you are still. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably harsher. For as long as we live, we will strive to suppress you, and your misery will be an example for posterity. However, we will spare your lives if you remain faithful. Choose now which course you want to follow." This is the refrain of the kings of all of the world. This is the kings, the potentates, the nobles, and the lords. You only have to listen to what they have to say. Now, the most powerful dynasty that enjoyed direct descent from the Atlantean bloodkin was the Tudor dynasty of England. The word Tudor comes from the word tutor, meaning the teachers, that is, the educated ones, those with knowledge. The leader of the Tudor dynasty during this period was called the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth Tudor, Elizabeth I, literally, she who must be obeyed. Here we have that term virgin again also, which one should note. The Virgin Queen. And the symbol of the Tudors was the famous rose, the Tudor rose. This is why, for instance, there is a rose garden near every government office or government central headquarters. And we have the War of the Roses, of course, in historical terms in England. The father of Elizabeth I was the famous Henry VIII, Henry Tudor. Queen Elizabeth I was put in charge of the problem of the Stargate, and as such she employed several different people. At the head of these individuals, she placed the man on the left who is known as Sir John Dee. And Sir John Dee's helper on this problem was Edward Kelly, the Irish clairvoyant. John Dee, Dr. John Dee, is the creator of Enochian magic. Note that word Enochian because Enoch, of course, is one of the prophets of the Old Testament. But the word Enoch also means the inner eye or the initiated ones. So Enochian magic is nothing more than the magic of the high ones, the magic of the initiated ones. And through Enochian magic, John Dee believed he could talk to the angels. Now, if we go to the actual book of Enoch, after which the word Enochian comes, the prophet Enoch had this to say in the very opening passage of his book. The words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the elect and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all the wicked and the godless are to be removed. And he took up his parable and said, Enoch, a righteous man, whose eyes were opened by God, saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angel showed me. And from them I heard everything, and from them I understood as I saw, but not for this generation, but for a remote one, which is for to come. So Enoch is prophesying our times again, the days of tribulation. It turns out that this mysterious master astrologer and court official and ambassador, Sir John Dee, was also the head of MI5, the British Secret Service. It's the first secret service that ever existed. The first secret police existed in Tudor England and was created by John Dee. And when John Dee used to go on occasion to visit the royal houses of other countries, and when he'd write back to his mistress, she who must be obeyed, Elizabeth I, he'd always sign at the bottom of his documents 007. That was the sigil of the head of the MI5 of those days. And of course, that is later picked up in the stories of Ian Fleming, and the reason for that is because Ian Fleming himself was a member in more modern times of the British Secret Service. And what better upon retirement than to write about his own organization? So the 007, the original, way back at the time of the Tudor dynasty, was Sir John Dee, master occultist. And if you study the symbol for MI5, you'll notice that it has a triangular pyramidical shape with the crown of the queen, and it has a eye, the Enochian eye, at the northern apex. Now, John Dee was one of the most powerful black magicians in history. He decided that it would be better to contact pan-dimensional intelligences to solve their little problem of quarantine. Via his system of magic and divination, he succeeded in opening a portal to these fourth-dimensional entities, or oversouls. Dee became a living macroscope. This was not the first time in history where such a forbidden rite was undertaken, and every time it does occur, it has the severest repercussions from history. So John Dee, being a master occultist and connected throughout the world, he looked into this problem and decided that there wasn't any normal technological or scientific way that they were going to be able to find this key, so to speak, to the Stargate. But he said he could use his occult power. So with Edward Kelly and all the other occultists of Europe, in combination, in concert, they decided to call on what are known in the occult world as pan-dimensional oversouls, beings that are above our level of consciousness. Not necessarily more pure or more spiritual, but of a higher spiritual intelligence, let's say. The oversouls. Later writers have called these entities the macrobes. This word comes from the fact that there are beings, creatures, entities below us who are called the microbes, and it takes a microscope to see them. Before the advent of the microscope, if anyone had told you that there's all sorts of little creatures and little entities, but you just can't see them, we would have thought they were crazy and probably burned them at the stake as being heretics. But as soon as we have the right instrument, we look through it and we're able to see a whole world, a whole ecostructure of microbes and bacteria and viruses and whatnot. Well, above the level of the human consciousness are the macrobes. And as yet, there's no instrument per se in order to see it. But there is an instrument, and that instrument is known as the human intuition. It's through the human intuition, the human imagination, that one can make contact with the macrobes. John Dee did make contact with the macrobes. In fact, he became what might be described as a living macroscope. Now, in short, Dee was told that there were two cardinal premises which needed to be mastered before the Stargate could be opened. The first precept concerned creating matter from energy, but that would have to be revealed in two main stages. And the second concerned the properties of a certain element, and that element was silicon. Now, phase 1 concerned creating matter from energy. But as the macrobes instructed John Dee, the human race was way too primitive for that. That phase 1 would have to be taught to them in 2 stages. Part 1 would be to learn how to do the exact reverse, release energy from matter. And then after that, they would be taught how to create matter from energy. And phase 1 of that was accomplished on July 16th, 1945, at Alamogordo, or the Trinity experiment, when the atomic bomb was released. So the splitting of the atom was phase A of phase 1, being able to release energy from matter. Later on, after that period, from the period of 1945, we would start to see experiments which would work on the rest. So MIT, SRI, Hoover Institute, and so on. These organizations are merely fronts for this experimentation, looking at how to now manipulate matter and create it from energy. Phase 2 was the silicon revolution, the properties of silicon. And of course we know that silicon is created, or is a gateway to the computer age. Silicon makes computing possible. And we're told that technology makes life easier. These are the cover stories that let us buy into some of this stuff. If Grandma can do her shopping on the internet, and we could talk over the internet and buy our VCRs, most people are happy and don't think of any of the occult reasons behind the creations of these powerful instruments. Now, one of the greatest New Atlanteans, other than John Dee and Elizabeth I and the Tudors, was Sir Francis Bacon. A Knight Templar, a major occultist, Sir Francis Bacon was appointed Solicitor General and Chief Advisor to the British Crown on June 25th, 1607. He conceived the idea of reactivating various secret societies, and in 1580 he founded the secret Rosicross Literary Society and the Lodge of Free and Accepted Speculative Masons. Bacon is said to have been introduced to the 33rd degree system into Masonry from the original Templar 9 degrees. So Bacon introduced the 33rd degree system into Freemasonry. For 1 year he had in his possession the first English translations of the Bible. In fact, he was the first major editor of what would become the King James Bible. He also added secret information into the Bible which was not there before. Now, William T. Smedley, who is a biographer of Francis Bacon, said, "It will eventually be proved that the whole structure of the authorized Bible was Francis Bacon's. He was an ardent student, not only of the Bible, but also of early manuscripts." So Francis Bacon was yet another one of the great thinkers and intelligences that was put onto the problem of the Stargate. He was directly working for the Tudor dynasty. In Talisman, by Graham Hancock and Robert Bivall, they write, "Bacon was a passionate exponent of Britain's colonialization and development of its recently acquired North American territory of Virginia. In 1606, the so-called Virginia Company, there's that word again, Virginia Company was granted a royal charter by James I, which allowed it virtually unlimited power of government in the colony. Bacon had been instrumental in the creation of the charter. Bearing this in mind, it is not surprising that in New Atlantis, Bacon refers to Benasalem as the Virgin of the world." That's right. Francis Bacon wrote 2 very important books that all scientists know. The first one was called The New Atlantis, and the other, The Nouveau Organum, the new organism. The new organism and the new Atlantis. Now, Sir John Dee worked closely with his confederates all over the globe. The information transmitted by the macrobes was done cryptically and was voluminous. He realized that many centuries would have to elapse before even the basics could be realized. He also knew how inefficient and counterproductive it was going to be to have separate genius types working in their private garrets all over the planet. The knowledge could not be collated efficiently in this way. So he and his masters devised a scheme to have the scholars come to one place to work and amass the knowledge. These places we know as the universities. And that's right. John Dee realized that it was going to be unproductive to have all these different scholars and occultists and eccentrics and whatnot working in all sorts of corners of the world. Better to bring them all into centralized locations. That's what the word college means. The word college means collage, where many can come together. And of course, there's the silicon connection, now fully understood. We've moved on even from the time of universities. Universities can collate. Yes, they can collate in libraries. You can have papers, you can have documents, but soon even that becomes so voluminous. Even that becomes open and privy. Now you can introduce hierarchies, you can introduce fraternity structures into the university system so that, again, you police people and only the purest, can ascend through the ranks to find out what the real agenda is. But even that, in the end, can become a problem. The computer is the miniature university with unlimited data storage space. So here we have a tie-in from the silicon idea and the carbon life forms. Because the internet promises you also worldwide communication. It's a virtual library, an endless space for archival storage. Now another level of information that the macrobes had transmitted to John Dee, and what he also realized from his interactions with these supernatural beings, was that in order to even move along with this process, it was going to take hundreds of years. And in fact, from what he was receiving from them, he realized that they would have to subjugate the whole planet in order to not only continue to move the technology forward, but in order to get the element silicon and be able to process it, the whole of the planet would have to be subjugated. And therefore it is from that time, it is from the time of the 15th and 16th and 17th century that we have all the idioms we associate with England. We have the rising of the great navies. We have the rising of empire. We have the rising of the first stock exchanges. And we have the rising of the colonial impulse. A tiny little nothing country, England, where 100 or 200 years before the kings were shivering in windowless castles, literally shivering, couldn't even get the taxes together to fight their neighbors. And suddenly we have empires beginning, empires starting, the great proliferation of what we now know to be the British Empire. And of course, in the vanguard of this were the beings that we know as the pirates, or the pirates, because the word pirates actually means the men of fire. These were direct agents of the Tudor dynasty. The heads of the pirates were the top officials of the pirates. The leaders of most of the pirates were the top brass of the Tudor dynasty, trained in the finest universities, even the fine maritime universities. And one of the greatest leaders of them all was Sir Francis Drake. And of course the word Drake actually means the dragon. San Francisco Bay was originally called Drake's Bay. The pirates, or the pirates, the men of fire, serving the Tudor dynasty, were headed by men like Sir Francis Drake and Edmund Spenser. He was the great-grandfather or the ancestor of Lady Diana Spenser. The progeny of the pirates settled on the lands that they conquered and opened the great universities for the education of their sons and daughters. They employed the fraternity structure to ensure that only the chosen would be exposed to the real occult history of the world and to their role as the future leaders and thinkers, overworld and underworld figures, educated and funded to adroitly lead the rest of mankind down whatever roads became necessary. In the tarot cards, for instance, the devil card is number 15. And we have the old pirate motto, 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. But the occult history of the pirates has really never been told. And of course the famous symbol of the pirates was the skull and crossbones, a symbol known to be used before them by the Knights of Malta and the Knights Templars or other occult fraternities. And the job of the pirates was to bring mayhem and disease and slaughter to all the lands that they colonized. These were agents of the British Crown and not, as the Errol Flynn movies of the swashbuckling buccaneers tries to show you, some romantic heroes. These people were cutthroats and they had an agenda to be sent out to all the corners of the world and to massacre whoever they found there. It's important to bring out at this time that the macrobes don't work for free. Though John Dee was successful in contacting them, and though the macrobes did transmit a great deal of information that he desired concerning the quarantine and Stargate problem, they don't work for nothing. And John Dee was soon to find out what it was that they wanted in exchange for their services. What they wanted has had the severest consequences for the future of mankind. The microbes basically told him that what they wanted was blood. Blood has some very specific occult properties, and that's what the microbes wanted. And John Dee, his reply was, how much do you want and when do you want it? Whatever it takes. This thing is already going to take us hundreds of years. Whatever you need for that information, you will get it. And so John Dee literally put the whole of the human race up in a great black magic mass, a great rite to his overlords, the oversouls that were asking him for payment, literally, in blood. Now, blood happens to be the second commonest word in the Bible after God. And Erich Fromm, the scholar, the German scholar, says, at a deep archaic level, blood is very peculiar substance. Quite generally, it has been equated with life and the life force, and is one of the three sacred substances that emanate from the body. The other two are semen and milk. Semen expresses male, while milk expresses female or motherly creativity, and both were considered sacred in many cults and rituals. Blood transcends the difference between the male and the female. In the deepest level of experience, one magically seizes the life force itself by shedding blood. Now, of course, we looked at earlier just how bloodthirsty the Nephilim had already been, and the progeny and the empires that came out of the Middle East. We know, and we've looked at how bloodthirsty and how warlike and rapacious those races and nations have already been. And now we're being put, the whole human race is being put up in a pact to some oversouls. Could that explain some of the calamities that we've endured since John Dee's time? Well, we've had inquisitions old and new. One of the most atrocious human beings ever to be on this planet, Joseph de Maistre, in his St. Petersburg's dialogues, has this to say: all grandeur, power, all subordination to authority rests on the executioner. He is the horror and the bond of human association. Remove this incomprehensible agent from the world, and at that very moment, order gives way to chaos. Thrones topple, and society disappears. Lust for the spilling of human blood is a touchstone of the synarchist mindset. Take the 19th century Spanish Catholic counter-revolutionary ideologue Juan Donoso Cortés, who argued that human sacrifice is the most universal of all human institutions. I say, gentlemen, that dictatorship in certain circumstances, such as those in which we find ourselves, for example, is a legitimate form of government. Dictatorship, indeed, is part of the divine order. The meanest reptile, which I would trample under my feet, would seem less despicable to me than man. The point of faith which most oppresses and weighs upon my reason is that of the nobility and dignity of the human species. So let's not say that it's far-fetched that certain individuals walking this planet think of the human being, as Cortés is saying here, lowlier than the humble reptile. And it even causes them great distress to think of the nobility of the human creature. Such is in the minds of the progeny of the warlocks of Atlantis. Cortés goes on to say the culmination of Donoso's philosophical treatise is that the institution of bloody sacrifice is the most universal of all human dogmas and institutions. The most civilized nations and the most savage tribes believe in a pure victim offered as a perfect holocaust, he wrote. Without the death penalty, without the purifying efficacy of blood, all societal bonds would collapse. Since the first day of the first effusion of blood, it has never ceased to flow, and it has never been shed in vain. Mankind has always believed in three things with an unconquerable faith: that the effusion of blood is necessary, that there is a manner of shedding blood which is purifying, and another mode which is condemnatory. History clearly attests these truths. It presents to us the narrative of cruel acts, of bloody conquests, of the overflow and destruction of famous cities, of atrocious murders committed, of pure victims offered on blood-stained altars, of brothers warring against brothers, of the rich oppressing the poor, and fathers tyrannizing over their children, until the earth appears to us like an immense sea of blood, which neither the piercing breath of the winds can dry up, nor the scorching rays of the sun can absorb. Well, in Russia, 10 million soldiers are said to have died, including 10 million civilians. In Germany, 3 million soldiers and 500,000 civilians. The death toll is awesome. The total of human lives lost in the Second World War is 18,200,000 soldiers and 16,300,000 civilians, for a grand total of 34 million deaths. And of course, in 1918, just after the war, the Spanish flu epidemic killed 20 million when the war killed 10. And in the Second World War, the Spanish flu killed even more men than the war did. Now, students of black magic, students of occultism, as well as the practitioners, also know that not only the killing of the victim is important, but also the time of the slaying and also the place. These are also important factors in any kind of ritual associated with black magic or occultism. And John Dee knew the same thing. Being a master occultist and being internationally connected, he understood that the slaughter of mankind, the sacrifice, the offerings to his dark oversouls, had to be also orchestrated correctly. Otherwise, that energy could not be correctly received. The cortisol or whatever properties of the blood, the energy that it contains, could not be properly received unless the deaths occurred in a ritualistic way. So just like the average common or garden Satanist has to draw his circle or create his altar to slaughter his victim, so in the same way do the ritual centers need to be fashioned. And in the same way as the universities were used to coalesce all the scholars, so instead of bringing victims to a site of slaughter, why not have them live in the center of the rite? Now we call these centers of sacrifice cities. The great cities of the world are in fact nothing more than ritual centers designed for the purpose of a massive holocaust. In David Oveson's monumental work, The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital, we find that there are no less than 23 complete zodiacs in the city of Washington, D.C. And there are over 1,000 zodiacal and planetary symbols embedded into that city. In London, there's 4. So in Washington, D.C., we have 23. That's 19 more than anywhere else in the world. Complete zodiacs secreted into the architecture of Washington, D.C. Now, why would that be? We also find from Oveson's book and also from Talisman by Graham Hancock that every laying of the cornerstones, the rites and rituals, and the founding of the Capitol building and the Library of Congress and all the places of government were meticulously and ritualistically done by Freemasons. David Oveson writes, in the years following the Revolution, the Masonic fraternities held ceremonial layings for such new enterprises as bridges, locks, universities, government buildings, state houses, memorials, and even churches. Such buildings were aligned with the stars and with the spiritual beings who ruled the stars. There may be no doubt, he says, that astrology played an important role in the choice of the key monuments for the laying down of the federal city. Even so, we are reduced to speculation as to which individual or group of individuals was behind this extraordinary undertaking. So David Oveson is a scholar who's understood that there's something mysterious going on here, but unfortunately he doesn't know why, and he admits that. He's a meticulous researcher, and he's gone to the Library of Congress, to the memoirs of the Founding Fathers, and he understands that Freemasons and other secret fraternities designed not only Washington, D.C., but Philadelphia and all of the European cities, Paris, London, Cologne. These cities are based on an occult pattern, a template, but he doesn't know why. In his book he writes, a survey of the foundation charts used in the building of Washington, D.C. reveals the importance of astrology and indeed confirms beyond doubt that astrology played an important role in the early Masonic rites. The rationale of astrology was rarely discussed openly, even in Masonic documents. Knowledge of the stars, insofar as they were understood in Masonic circles, was preserved as secrets best left to those with specialist knowledge of such things. The extraordinary truth is that the very existence of the Washington Monument is intimately linked with the Egyptian star Sirius, the Sihor that the ancients represented in their sacred hieroglyphics as an obelisk as well as a star. How is it possible that this most important star of the ancient world should find itself, as it were, resurrected in the architecture of the United States? In the course of that day, when the cornerstone of the Washington Monument was laid, the sun would have passed directly over Sirius. And the Declaration of Independence. Oveson says, computations clearly show that on that day, the Declaration of Independence was agreed in Philadelphia. The sun was on Sirius. The Mason who first signed the Declaration of Independence would have been aware of the particular significance of July 4th as a cosmic event. The day was the second of the so-called Dog Days, which begin on July 3rd. And these so-called Dog Days are sacred to the Egyptians because it's when the star Sirius is rising to its zenith. In fact, on the moon landing, faked or not, but on that day, again in July, Sirius was at its highest point when the words were being said that the eagle has landed. The star Sirius was brightest in the sky and rising to its zenith. Here we have David Oveson's own words. The dog days are so called because they refer to the rising of the star Sirius. But the word dog here may be a corruption of dag, or dagon, or dragon. In this case, Sirius is not the dog star, but the dragon star, or the star of the dragons. For within a year of Washington's death, it was recognized that the great man should most fittingly be memorialized by means of a massive pyramid. That's right, a massive Egyptian pyramid was the original commemoration of George Washington. The pyramid was already widely used as a symbol in Masonic fraternities in Europe, and we should therefore not be surprised that it should have been proposed in the context of a national symbol guided by so many Freemasons. Whoever was directing the planning of Washington, D.C., not only had a considerable knowledge of astrology, but had a vested interest in emphasizing the role of Virgo, the Virgin. The American Constitution was put before people on September 19th, 1798, in Virgo. Oveson says, the ancient records indicate that it was a practice in former ages for the mystery centers that directed civilization to hand out newly founded cities to the care of specific spiritual beings. The practice of assigning places to the rule of specific zodiacal signs, and thus in medieval times to spiritual beings, is very ancient and has been extended into modern times. Since the discovery of America, we are able to trace most of the sources for the zodiacal rulerships ascribed to the cities of the United States. So what is this man telling us? Suddenly, we're now reading this man's incredible research in the 90s, that cities are ascribed to not only zodiacal signs of the horoscope, of the zodiac, of the stars, but the spiritual beings that rule those energies and rule those stars. Why have we not been told this before? What does it mean? Why is this being found in the memoirs and the documents of the founding fathers of America, senior Freemasons, who not only paid attention to the computations of the heavens when they put in the stone of the Washington Monument in the Capitol building, but who saw to it that the very timings in which these rocks were laid or these stones were placed had significance sidereally. Perhaps it is sufficient, he says, that we recognize as true the medieval arcane notion that such beings could be invited to participate in the life of a city by means of the spiritual art of astrology. Of course, in Latin, these beings are called the cosmocrates, angelic beings, or the angeli motivori. They are beings that move the planets, participating directly in human affairs. For what purpose? For what reason? Oveson says the leader of these mighty beings was due to take over the direction of Western civilization in 1881. This caused considerable excitement in the esoteric circles of Washington, D.C., and the occult world in general. Now, in astrology, for those who've done their homework and really researched the esoteric aspects of astrology, two particular signs are of great importance. The northern sign of Cancer and the southern sign of Capricorn face each other, just like you have on the globe, the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. Now, the Tropic of Cancer, or the northern sign of Cancer, was often called the gate of the souls. Cancer is ruled by the moon, and the moon was considered how the souls enter in to birth. They enter into the planet birth at the time of their birth. They enter in through the moon, through the gate of Cancer, the gate of life. And then when we die and we pass out, mortality, we pass out through the sign of Capricorn, which is ruled by the planet Saturn, which was once attributed to death. So we have the gate of the north and the gate of the south. When we look at different cities, we find that not only do we have this zodiological motif in the architecture, but we often have the piazza, or the center point, which often has a gate at the north and a gate at the south, just like in Vatican City, or in Washington, D.C., or in London, or in Rome, or in Paris. It is also a fact that the Earth is networked with ley lines. These ley lines can often be referred to as dragon paths. Technically, they're called synchronic lines or axiational lines. And as we saw earlier on, Alfred Watkins discovered them, or rediscovered them, at the turn of the century and called them the ley lines. And these are patterns of energy, a great dodecahedron that surrounds the Earth. And it is found by those who study geomancy and feng shui of the Earth that great buildings, cathedrals, churches, and state buildings are often placed at the vertices and key parts, key intersections, key vertices of these ley lines. As Oveson was saying, not only does Washington, D.C. have innumerable zodiacs secreted into it, but many of the different ceremonies and festivals involve the star Sirius. Well, if you go to the Egyptian, you find that when they tried to write the symbol for Sirius, they used a star, a five-pointed star, a oval, and an obelisk. That's right, they used a pentagram shape, an obelisk, and an oval. Well, isn't that exactly what you see in concrete and marble and granite in the city of Washington? The U.S. Pentagon, the U.S. Monument, and the Oval Office? Why would the whole layout of Washington, D.C. be literally a hieroglyphic in stone of the star Sirius? And it's been noted before that the layout of the central buildings from Shooters Hill onwards, from the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol Building, are all aligned with the horizon to key celestial events and compass points. Graham Hancock says on this subject, for reasons and motives not yet too clear, the ceremonies, festivities, and city monuments associated with the sister American and French revolutions display Masonic ideas and imagery, and are heavily tinged with Egyptian connotations and symbols. Well, isn't that who the Freemasons were? The word Freemason comes from as early as Egypt, the creators of the pyramids and the Sphinx, the ones who were the workers in stone, the Freemasons. Masons are those who work in stone. Graham Hancock goes on to say, what the American Revolution or War of Independence was much influenced by Freemasons and Masonic ideologies and principles is a well-accepted thesis. Freemasonry was the driving force behind the ideals and tenets of the American Revolution. What is less well known is the fact that there was a very close connection between the French and American Masonic lodges at this time. In those days, Freemasonry in America was regulated by a united Grand Lodge in England, which appointed provincial Grand Masters in various regions of the North American continent. Jean-André Fauchier, a Masonic historian, says, "It is certain that the Freemasons of the Nine Sisters Lodge and other lodges who contributed to the collapse of the monarchy and to the success of the revolution were in great numbers." We also have the image of the obelisk, Egyptian obelisks in American cities. And these can be situated in the same way that an acupuncturist uses needles to enhance or to suppress the energies of the physical body. The idea of the Egyptians and the ancient geomancers was to position these statues and these obelisks and these towers at key points of the earth in order to either inflate energy and conduct energy, earth energy, or to suppress energy. Just in the same way, the Chinese doctor will use a needle or will use acupressure to do the same thing for your own body. That is why when you go to certain places where these objects exist, you will feel very good energy at certain places, and you'll feel very peaceful and calm and majestic. And then sometimes when you go to other cities, you have an indescribable feeling of dis-ease and not feel so good. It all has to do with the architecture and the geometry that's involved in the layouts of the cities. But it goes back a long, long way. Thousands and thousands of years before, primitive societies would create the phallic towers in order to transmute the energies of the earth. Washington, D.C. has a large pentagram also involved, and the shape of the owl. There's a large owl in the street plan and the street design. The U.S. Pentagon, we were talking about pentagrams. Well, the U.S. Pentagon is a very important shape and a very important building. It also faces the Egyptian star, Thuban, which used to be the star associated with war. So here we have the U.S. Pentagon actually pointing or facing the ancient star of war, Thuban. It was actually designed or co-designed by John Whiteside Parsons, who's got many secret society connections. He actually helped to design the Pentagon, and he was a high priest in OTO, that's Ordo Templi Orientis, a German Freemasonic lodge, and he was also a close friend of L. Ron Hubbard, the creator of Scientology. And though the Pentagon is very angular, it is actually based on the symbol of the Tudor rose. If you were to soften the edges of the Pentagon just a little, it would bear almost uncannily resemblance for the Tudor rose. And why not? It's the Tudor dynasty who's paying the bills. The Pentagon, if you put the arms back onto a pentagon, you have a pentagram, the great symbol of the star Sirius. And all the military generals wear the symbol of the pentagram. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was raised as a master mason in 1911 at the Holland Lodge No. 8 in New York, and in 1929 became a 33-degree Scottish Rite Freemason at the Albany Consistory. He would have been aware, as were all high-ranking Scottish Rite Masons who had read Albert Pike's Moral and Dogma, that the pentagonal shape, or pentacle, was associated by Pike with the Masonic blazing star, and in turn identified with the five-pointed star of ancient Egypt, Sirius. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Pentagon was on September 11th, 1941. Here is a rendition of the Tudor rose. The Lancasters of England had a red rose as symbol, and the Yorks had a white, just like the old red and white dragons of the Arthurian period. David Ovison goes on to talk about the pentagram. He says, when found in a text, and that also means on a symbol, the star determined or indicated to the reader that the group of hieroglyphics associated with it was related to spiritual matters. It was related to the heavens, to invisible energies, which the Greeks called etheric. So, what's he telling us here? That if you actually see somebody, a general, wearing the symbols of the pentagram, if you see a pentagram on the side of a tank, if you see a US Pentagon shaped like that, if you see a flag, which nearly all the flags of the world contain the five-pointed star, or you see the star on any other thing, chances are it's been put there consciously to represent something etheric, something spiritual, something otherworldly. So here we are in our materialistic world, being taught materialistic philosophy from the time we come out of the womb, told that not to pay attention to anything to do with the occult, and marginalized and sequestered and lambasted if we are, and yet we find out that those in the highest echelons of society are well versed in the most arcane spiritual matters, even to the point of designing the cities in which we live. Here's the Masonic five-pointed star. And of course, the five-pointed star is also connected with other celestial cycles like the Leviathan cycle, great cosmic cycles. In Paris, we have a literal zodiac leading up to the Champs-Élysées. We have the 12 radiating streets coming to a point. The city is literally designed as a zodiac by French Freemasons. The city of London is situated on the ancient Celtic power points and is divided into 28 boroughs in order to synchronize with the 28 lunar phases. Talking about rituals that go on in the cities, here we have the Great Fire of London, which began on the 2nd of September 1666. The fire started in the house and shop of Thomas Farnior, baker to King Charles II in Pudding Lane. By the way, the Jewish festival of Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Judgment, was only 10 days away. The Great Fire swept over the city of London like a great blowtorch, clearing an area 1.5 miles long and half a mile wide. It destroyed almost everything from Tower Hill in the east to Temple in the west, where it finally burned itself out in front of Temple Church, a distinctive round structure built of stone in the Gothic style. But it is probable that the king was not entirely displeased at this opportunity, for he himself was a bit of a dabbler in town planning and design. Since the Restoration, he had been bitterly frustrated by the lack of funds to transform London into a splendid metropolis that would eclipse the city of light that his cousin, Louis XIV, was turning Paris into. Now here, out of the blue, had come his amazing opportunity that might allow him to do just that. In Graham Hancock's book, Talisman, he speaks about the Fire of London, saying, "A few days after the Great Fire finally abated, Christopher Wren and John Evelyn, each man apparently acting independently, rushed to present Charles II with plans for the full reconstruction of London. To be precise, Wren presented his plan on the 11th of September, 1666. Wow, there's that strange date again, September 11th, 1666. And Evelyn presented his on the 13th of September, 1666. Both men, invisibly, incorporated esoteric symbolic devices into their proposed layouts for the streets and plazas of London, and can only have been done so with the same purpose in mind. Exactly the same symbolic devices, again apparently used for the same purposes, turns up more than a century later on the other side of the Atlantic in the layout for the streets and plazas of Washington, D.C., the newly built capital of the United States of America. It is known that Elias Ashmole was frequently asked by King Charles II to cast horoscopes for various stately functions, and more particularly, after the Great Fire of 1666, to select favorable dates for the layings of the cornerstones of important buildings. Indeed, the tradition of casting horoscopes, or selecting propitious astrological dates for the laying of cornerstones of important buildings and monuments, was then and remains today a common practice in Freemasonry. Now, we heard in the previous slide that King Charles may have in fact wanted the city to burn down, and may have even started the city. After all, it was his baker that the fire started, in his baker's shop. And according to Lady Queensborough in her monumental book, Occult Theocracy, Lady Queensborough, who studied the writings of spies that are operating in London, found evidence to say that the fire was in fact started consciously and wasn't just an accident. Lady Queensborough, or Lady Edith Starr Mill, was one of the first writers on the subjects of occult theocracies and secret societies and subversive movements throughout the world. So this is a lady that needs to be read. Her book, Occult Theocracy, goes into that and talks about the Fire of London being by design. One of the other purposes that the ancients made of the dragon paths, the ley lines, or the axiational lines was to commemorate the dead. Many of the ancient stone structures and megalithic sites are actually burial grounds. Not all of them, but some of them are burial grounds. And the same idea transformed and moved over into the modern context. Whenever a great shaman or a great leader or a great master or a great founder of a city or the head of a nation would fall, it was the habit to position their grave or their tomb near one of the major axiational lines or vertices. Monuments of great geometric and geomantic power were constructed to encapsulate the wisdom of a departed serpent. And this process was carried on by both contingents, both the Atlanteans, when one of their champions or heroes or special individuals would fall, they also would intern them at a particular location of the earth grid. And that is why it is when we go to certain places of the world again, we feel a tremendous feeling of spiritual uplift and creative inspiration. And then we go to certain other places and we don't feel the same way. It could also account for the reason why certain places are tranquil and beautiful and have a very powerful vortex, and other places are war-torn and rent with all manner of upheaval. The ancient burial grounds of the serpent masters. Here in Ohio, we have the Ohio serpent, clearly defining the fact that these are commemorated to the serpent people. Here in Avebury, and of course in Ireland, we have the graves of the famous gods of the Gaels. But as I said, the dark side also have their positioning. In fact, the word Capitol comes from Caput Draconis, the head and the tail of the dragon. At Tiahuanaco, according to Inca